The hill looks ordinary at first, almost too ordinary for what it is hiding. It rises from the limestone plateau of southeastern Anatolia with the quiet patience of something that has watched weather, empires, languages, and gods pass over it without needing to announce itself. Wind moves across the dry grass. Far below, the Harran Plain opens wide beneath the sky. In the distance, the Taurus Mountains hold their blue edge against the horizon, and somewhere beyond them are the headwaters of the Euphrates, one of the great rivers around which later civilizations will build kingdoms, laws, armies, temples, and cities. But here, on this rounded mound, the story begins before those things are supposed to exist. It begins before writing, before kings, before pottery, before bronze, before wheels, before the first true city streets. It begins at a time when human beings are still expected, in the older archaeological imagination, to be small wandering bands following animals, gathering wild plants, and leaving behind little more than stone tools, hearths, bones, and the faint stains of temporary camps. And yet beneath this hill stand pillars. They are not rough stones dragged into place by chance. They are shaped, they are planned, they are arranged in rings. Some are taller than a person, some weigh many tons. Many are carved in the form of a capital T, with broad heads and long vertical bodies, like silent figures without faces, watching from a world that has almost entirely vanished. On their surfaces are animals cut with a confidence that still feels startling: foxes, snakes, wild boars, cranes, vultures, scorpions, creatures of claw and beak and fang. Some seem to crawl along the stone as if the pillar itself were alive. Others stand rigid, almost heraldic, as though fixed in a symbolic language whose grammar has been lost. There are belts, arms, hands, strange signs, and shapes that may have carried meanings as clear to their makers as words do to us, though scholars still debate what they were meant to say. This place is Göbekli Tepe, and its age is the beginning of the shock. The oldest monumental enclosures date back roughly to the 10th millennium BCE, around 11,000 or more years ago, in the early pre-pottery Neolithic. That means some of its great stone circles were raised at a time when agriculture was only beginning to emerge, when domesticated animals were not yet the foundation of life here, when the great urban civilizations of Mesopotamia still lay thousands of years in the future. The first cities of Sumer, with their temples, walls, canals, and scribes, belong to a world far younger than this hill. Even Stonehenge, so often treated as ancient beyond easy comprehension, is younger by many millennia. Göbekli Tepe does not merely sit at the edge of history, it stands in the dark before history, where the usual sequence of human progress begins to blur. For a long time, the story seemed simple enough. First humans learned to farm. Farming created surplus. Surplus allowed larger settlements. Larger settlements required organization. Organization produced specialists, priests, leaders, builders, and eventually temples. In that version of the past, monumentality is a late achievement, the reward for settled life. People grow grain, live together, build houses, store food, manage animals, and only then do they gather the resources to raise ceremonial architecture. But Göbekli Tepe appears to disturb that order. Here is monumental construction before the expected full package of village life has clearly settled into place. Here is a place of gathering before the city, a place of carved stone before pottery, perhaps a place of ritual before bread becomes ordinary. The evidence remains incomplete, and the older story has not simply collapsed, but it has been forced to bend. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, because the strange power of Göbekli Tepe is not that it proves some fantasy of lost super-civilizations or forgotten visitors from the sky. It does something more unsettling and more human. It suggests that the people of the deep past may have been far more socially ambitious, symbolically complex, and capable of large-scale cooperation than they were once given credit for. The mystery is not that humans could not have built it. The mystery is why archaeologists had become so accustomed to thinking they would not. The hill itself did not begin as a legend. For centuries it was part of the lived landscape, a place of stones and fields, known locally, touched by ploughs, crossed by shepherds. The name Göbekli Tepe is often translated as Potbelly Hill, a rounded swelling in the land. To the untrained eye, the broken limestone fragments scattered across its surface could be dismissed as natural rubble or later debris. But the mound was not natural in the simple sense. It had grown from human action. Layer upon layer filled and reshaped over time. What looked like a modest hill was, in part, an enormous archaeological concealment. The builders, or people not long after them, had buried the great enclosures deliberately, packing them with earth, stone chips, animal bones, tools, and refuse. The site was not merely forgotten under drifting dust. It was covered, enclosed, sealed into the ground. That act gives Göbekli Tepe its first haunting quality. Most ruins become ruins because they are abandoned, burned, conquered, quarried, or slowly taken apart by time. Here, at least some of the monumental spaces seem to have been carefully backfilled. People return to these circles not only to build, carve, and gather, but eventually to close them. Why they did this remains one of the great unresolved questions. Perhaps the enclosures had life cycles, born, used, renewed, and ritually buried. Perhaps older spaces were covered to make room for new ones. Perhaps the act of burial preserved memory rather than erased it. No single explanation fully accounts for this, and that uncertainty matters, because it reminds us that this was not just architecture, it was behaviour, and it was intentioned. Imagine approaching the hill when the pillars still stood open beneath the sun. The landscape would not have been the same dry world visible today. At the end of the last ice age and the beginning of the Holocene, this region was changing. Cooler, harsher conditions were giving way to warmer patterns, though not smoothly, not gently, and not all at once. Wild cereals grew in the surrounding areas. Herds moved through the steppe and open woodland, gazelle, aurochs, wild sheep, and boar were part of the living world. Birds circled above seasonal wetlands and valleys. Pistachio, almond, and other wild resources formed part of a rich ecological mosaic. This was not a barren stage on which civilization suddenly appeared. It was a world of opportunity, risk, memory, and movement. A world where people understood the habits of animals, the ripening of plants, the shape of stone, and the power of gathering at the right place at the right time. The people who came here did not leave writing to explain themselves. They did not leave royal inscriptions boasting of their achievements. They did not name their gods in clay tablets, or record the labour required to raise the stones. What survives in the record suggests something stranger than a simple village temple, and more grounded than a mythic lost empire. Flint tools show skilled craftsmanship. Animal bones point to hunting and feasting. The carved imagery suggests a symbolic universe crowded with dangerous, vivid beings. The scale of the pillars points to cooperation, planning and shared purpose. The absence, at least in the earliest monumental layers, of clear ordinary houses directly attached to the great enclosures has encouraged the idea that Göbekli Tepe may have been a special gathering place rather than a normal settlement. But even that interpretation has shifted as excavations across the wider region reveal more complexity. The site is not frozen in one meaning, it is a long story in stone. This is why the phrase "the city built before humans should have built cities" is both powerful and slightly misleading. Göbekli Tepe was not a city in the later sense. It had no known streets lined with homes, no palace, no marketplace, no written administration, no defensive wall marking an urban boundary. Calling it a city too literally would flatten the evidence into something it is not. But the phrase captures a deeper disturbance. The site shows city-like ambition before cities. It shows monumentality, coordination, symbolic density, and repeated communal effort at a time when the old models expected far less. It is not a city, and that is exactly why it matters. It forces the question of what a city really grows from. Is it grain? Is it storage? Is it trade? Is it authority? Or does it begin earlier, in the human ability to imagine a shared centre, a place powerful enough to draw people together before permanent settlement has fully taken hold? Seen from above, the enclosures are like buried thoughts. Their circular and oval forms sit inside the mound, one phase cutting across another, later structures smaller and different from earlier ones. The great T-shaped pillars stand at the centre of some enclosures in pairs, with others set around them like a ring of witnesses. The central pillars sometimes have carved arms and hands, making them seem less like abstract supports and more like stylized beings. They do not have carved faces. That absence may be meaningful, or it may simply reflect a visual convention we no longer understand. The builders knew what they were doing. The problem is that we do not know what they thought they were doing. And so the hill waits between categories. It is older than the world that should explain it. It is too organized to be dismissed as a camp, too early to fit comfortably into the classic story of civilization, too human to require fantasies, and too strange to be reduced to a simple temple label without caution. It belongs to the threshold moment when people are beginning to gather more often, stay longer, experiment with plants, intensify social bonds, and reshape landscapes not merely for survival but for meaning. It stands at the edge of agriculture, at the edge of settlement, at the edge of history itself. By the time archaeologists began to understand what lay beneath Potbelly Hill, the old stones had already done their quiet damage to expectation. The past was not a ladder with each rung neatly placed above the last. It was a field of experiments, some forgotten, some failed, some transformed into the foundations of everything that came later. Göbekli Tepe does not show humans suddenly becoming modern. They already were. It shows something even more profound. People long before cities gathering under open skies to build a centre larger than any one band, any one season, perhaps any one lifetime. A city had not yet appeared, but the impulse that would one day make cities possible was already there, carved into limestone, buried under a hill, waiting for the modern world to notice. To understand why Göbekli Tepe unsettles the story so deeply, the mind has to step backward from the carved pillars and return to the world before the first streets. Not a world of emptiness, not a primitive blank waiting for civilization to begin, but a world with its own knowledge, rhythms, territories, dangers, and forms of memory. The people who live across the hills and plains of the late Ice Age do not think of themselves as living before anything. They are not rehearsing for history. They are already fully human, already watching the sky, tracking animals, shaping stone, burying their dead, making ornaments, painting bodies, remembering places, and moving through landscapes dense with meaning. What they lack is not intelligence. What they lack is the particular arrangement of life that later ages will call civilization-crowded towns, fields under cultivation, stored grain, permanent houses in large numbers, specialized labor, written records, institutional authority, and the strange new habit of living surrounded by walls built by people who will never know everyone inside them. For much of the 20th century, archaeology told the rise of civilization as a sequence with a certain satisfying logic. Hunter-gatherers moved, farmers settled, villages grew, villages became towns, towns became cities, cities produced temples, rulers, armies, and writing. The sequence was never quite as simple as popular summaries made it sound, but it had an intuitive force. Farming seemed to be the great hinge. Once people learned to domesticate plants and animals, they could produce more food from a smaller area, store the surplus, support larger populations, and free some members of society from the daily work of finding food. Those freed hands could become builders, priests, craft specialists, traders, administrators, and eventually scribes. In this model, monuments were the children of agriculture. They came after the granary, after the village, after a stable food supply made them possible. There is still truth in that model, especially when looking at the great urban civilizations that arise much later in Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, China, and elsewhere. Cities need food. They need labor. They need ways to coordinate people, resolve disputes, move materials, and maintain social order under pressure. But Göbekli Tepe stands in an earlier and stranger zone, where the neat sequence becomes harder to defend. Its builders appear in a world where farming is emerging but not yet fully dominant, where domestic animals are not yet the backbone of economy, where pottery has not yet become part of everyday life, and where permanent village settlement is uneven, experimental, and regionally varied. The evidence remains incomplete, but the site suggests that symbolic and ritual life may not simply have followed agriculture. In some places, it may have helped pull people toward the conditions that made agriculture more likely. The late Ice Age world is not stable. For thousands of years before Göbekli Tepe's earliest monumental phases, climates have shifted, warmed, cooled, dried, and softened again. People adapt not with a single invention but with endless local knowledge. They know where water gathers after rain, where wild grasses ripen, where herds pass in certain seasons, where flint nodules can be struck into blades, where limestone can be cut, where caves offer shelter, where valleys funnel animals, where danger waits. Their maps not drawn on parchment. They're carried in bodies, stories, habits, and roots. A ridge is not just a ridge. It may be a lookout, a boundary, a place of ancestors, a place where a rare plant grows, or a place where hunters once failed and remembered why. In the world around southeastern Anatolia, these patterns matter intensely. This region sits near what later scholars call the Fertile Crescent, a broad arc where wild ancestors of wheat, barley, sheep, goats, pigs, and cattle are found. But in the period before full farming, these are not yet domesticated resources arranged neatly for human convenience. Wild einkorn and emmer wheat grow where conditions suit them. Gazelle herds move according to weather and pasture. Wild boar keep to cover. Aurochs, the enormous wild ancestors of cattle, are powerful and dangerous. To live well here requires attention. It requires memory over generations. It requires knowing when abundance can be trusted and when it cannot. Hunter-gatherer life in such a world is often misunderstood. The phrase can make people imagine small groups barely surviving, constantly hungry, without time for anything beyond necessity. Sometimes life surely is harsh, and famine, injury, disease, and conflict are real dangers. But many hunter-gatherer societies, ancient and recent, show that mobility does not mean simplicity. A group may move because it knows the land deeply, not because it is lost. It may gather in larger numbers seasonally, then disperse when resources thin. It may form alliances, exchange goods, arrange marriages, share rituals, maintain obligations, and return to significant places repeatedly across generations. The absence of cities does not mean the absence of society. It means society takes forms less visible to archaeologists. That visibility problem is crucial. Stone survives. Bone sometimes survives. Hearths leave traces. Pits, post holes, burials, pigments, beads, and grinding stones can survive under the right conditions. But songs vanish. Gestures vanish. Myths vanish unless they are later written down, and by then they may be transformed beyond recognition. Rules of kinship, seasonal ceremonies, initiation rites, feasting obligations, mourning practices, and sacred geographies may leave only faint archaeological shadows. So when archaeologists once imagined pre-agricultural people as socially limited, part of the problem was not simply prejudice, it was preservation. The most important structures in a mobile world may not be stone buildings, they may be relationships, roots, and memories, all of which decay unless anchored in durable material. Göbekli Tepe is startling because it anchors something in stone. It takes a world that might otherwise seem archaeologically faint and gives it weight, height, and carved surfaces. It says, unmistakably, that people before settled urban life could organize labor for projects not reducible to immediate survival. They could quarry limestone, shape pillars, transport them, raise them, carve them, and return to the same place again and again. That does not mean they lived in a city. It does not mean they had kings or slaves or a hidden empire. Scholars still debate the exact scale of organization required, and experimental estimates vary depending on how one imagines quarrying and transport. But the basic fact remains these were not casual acts. They required planning, cooperation, and shared motivation. The older assumption that agriculture must come first also begins to weaken when one considers feasting. A group does not need full farming to gather large numbers of people temporarily. It needs a reason, a place, and enough food for the moment. Across many societies, feasts are not merely meals. They create alliances, settle debts, display generosity, attract partners, honor the dead, mark seasons, and establish prestige. If people came to Göbekli Tepe from different bands or communities, the labor of building and the act of eating together may have been inseparable. Wild animals could be hunted in quantity. Wild grains could be gathered and processed. Fermented drinks may even have played a role, though the evidence is debated and should not be stretched too far. What survives suggests that food, labor, and ritual may have reinforced one another. This possibility changes the emotional shape of the story. Instead of imagining a village that becomes prosperous and then decides to build a temple, one can imagine gatherings that become powerful enough to alter settlement itself. People come for ceremonies, for ancestors, for animals carved in stone, for obligations whose details are lost. They need food for those gatherings. They harvest more intensively. They return to the same stands of wild grain. They learn which plants respond well to disturbance, selection, and repeated collection. They begin to stay longer. The line between gathering and cultivation blurs before anyone would recognize a field in the later sense. No single explanation fully accounts for this, but the possibility is profound. The desire to gather may have helped create the need to produce. The world before cities is therefore not a waiting room. It is a threshold full of experiments. In some places, people remain mobile for millennia and thrive. In others, they settle near rich aquatic resources without farming. Elsewhere, they cultivate plants but continue hunting heavily. The path to agriculture is not one road with one destination. It is a braided river, splitting and rejoining, shaped by climate, ecology, population, tradition, accident, and desire. Göbekli Tepe belongs to one of those channels where monumentality appears early, where ritual architecture takes form before the full domestic landscape around it is clear. The surprise is sharpened by the absence of writing. Later cities explain themselves endlessly. Even when they lie, kings carve victories into stone, temples record offerings, merchants track accounts, bureaucrats preserve lists that outlive the hands that wrote them. At Göbekli Tepe there is no such voice. The stones speak through arrangement, labour, imagery, and burial. Their silence is not empty. It is simply not verbal. The people who built them may have had rich oral traditions, names for every animal and enclosure, stories for every carving, rules for who could enter, who could touch, who could remember, and who could return. But all of that is gone. The result is a place that feels both intimate and unreachable, built by human hands, yet sealed behind the loss of human words. This is why the first encounter with Göbekli Tepe is not merely astonishment at age. Age alone can impress, but age is not the whole mystery. The deeper disturbance lies in what the site reveals about the capacities already present before the familiar machinery of civilization. People did not need writing to coordinate meaning. They did not need cities to imagine centers. They did not need kings, at least not obviously, to raise stones. They did not need domesticated wheat fields stretching to the horizon before they could build something that would outlast them by 11,000 years. What they needed was a shared world powerful enough to make the work worthwhile. And somewhere on that hill, before the first streets, such a world existed. The first modern clues did not arrive with thunder. They appeared as fragments, inconvenient stones in a farmer's field, worked pieces of limestone where ordinary geology should have been less orderly, hints of something shaped beneath the soil. For a long time, the hill kept its secret because it did not look like the entrance to a lost world. It looked like land. It looked like a mound with scattered debris. A place that could be walked across without understanding that every step passed above chambers of buried time. This is often how the deep past survives, not as a gleaming doorway but as a disturbance in the ground, a texture that does not quite belong, a line of stone too deliberate to be natural, a pattern that waits for the right question. Göbekli Tepe was noticed before it was understood. In the 1960s, a survey connected with the wider archaeological work in the region recorded the mound, but its true significance was not recognized. Some of the stone fragments were interpreted as belonging to later periods, perhaps Byzantine graves or ordinary ancient remains. It was a reasonable mistake in one sense, because archaeology often begins by sorting the possible from the impossible, and at the time, monumental stone architecture of such age did not fit easily into expectation. The mind sees what its framework allows it to see. A hilltop in southeastern Anatolia with limestone slabs and worked pieces could be ancient. Yes, but not that ancient. Not a place where hunter-gatherers or very early villagers had raised pillars before pottery, before cities, before the full agricultural world. The evidence was there, but the category for it was not ready. That changed in the 1990s when Klaus Schmidt, a German archaeologist working in the region after earlier experience at nearby Neolithic sites, visited the mound and recognized that the stones were not ordinary. The landscape around Schönlöfe had already begun to reveal traces of the early Neolithic, and Schmidt understood that the limestone fragments on Göbekli Tepe's surface might belong to something far older and far more important than previously suspected. What followed was not a single dramatic uncovering of a complete city, but years of excavation, interpretation, revision, and surprise. Archaeology rarely gives up its secrets cleanly. It reveals edges, surfaces, cuts, fills, bones, tools, and alignments. The story has to be assembled from pieces that do not explain themselves. As the soil came away, the first great enclosures began to emerge. The structures were not built like later temples with rectangular rooms and roofs in the familiar sense. They were circular or oval spaces, defined by walls and rings of T-shaped pillars, with two larger pillars standing in the centre of some enclosures. These central pillars were not merely big, they were commanding. Their shape suggested stylized human forms, the horizontal top like a head or shoulders, the vertical shaft like a body, and in some cases carved arms running down the sides with hands meeting near the front. There were belts, loincloth-like forms, and animal motifs cut into the stone. The figures had no faces, which makes them feel less personal and more symbolic, as if they represent beings whose identity was not meant to be shown through eyes or mouths. Scholars still debate whether they should be understood as ancestors, spirits, gods, mythic beings, ritual actors, or something outside all those later categories. The enclosures were given modern labels, letters rather than ancient names, because the original names are lost. Enclosure D became especially famous, with its paired central pillars and surrounding ring of carved stones. Other enclosures revealed different arrangements, different carvings, different states of preservation. Some pillars had been broken, some had been reused, some were still partly buried, suggesting that much remained hidden. Ground-penetrating surveys hinted at additional structures beneath the mound, waiting in darkness. The site was not a single monument but a layered complex, built, modified, filled, and built again across centuries or more. What survives in the record suggests repeated return, not a one-time act. The stones themselves tell a story of labour before they tell a story of belief. The builders used the limestone bedrock of the hill. Nearby quarries preserved traces of extraction, including unfinished pillars still attached to the rock, like thoughts interrupted halfway into form. One unfinished pillar is enormous, larger than many of those erected, and its presence is almost more revealing than a finished monument. It shows the process frozen in place, the choice of stone, the cutting around it, the freeing of a long body from the bedrock, the risk that it might crack or prove impossible to move. Limestone is softer than granite, but softness should not be confused with ease. To cut, shape, transport, and raise multi-ton pillars without metal tools, draft animals, wheels, or modern lifting equipment requires skill and coordination. Flint tools could work the stone, and human labour could move astonishing weights when organised intelligently. But the task remained demanding. The scale has often invited exaggeration. Popular accounts sometimes leap from difficulty to impossibility, and from impossibility to lost civilizations or other unsupported explanations. But archaeology does not need those shortcuts. Human groups around the world have moved heavy stones with simple technologies when motivated by ritual, prestige, burial, astronomy, territorial identity, or sacred obligation. The question at Göbekli Tepe is not whether humans could do it. They could. The question is what kind of social world made them want to do it here, so early, and again and again. As excavation continued, another surprise deepened the mystery the enclosures had been intentionally filled. The fill contained limestone rubble, soil, flint artifacts, and enormous quantities of animal bone, much of it from wild species. This was not the slow accumulation of wind-blown dust alone. The spaces had been packed. Their interiors were closed with material that itself carried traces of human activity. The act of burial may have been practical, ritual, or both. It protected the structures in a way no one could have intended for modern archaeologists. Yet it also ended their open use. A monument usually seeks visibility. Göbekli Tepe's great enclosures were made visible, used, and then hidden. That rhythm of revelation and concealment is one of the site's most haunting features. The animal bones in the fill and surrounding deposits point toward a world still heavily dependent on hunting. Gazelle, wild cattle, wild boar, wild sheep, fox, hare, birds, and other animals appear in the remains. These were not barnyard creatures in the later farming sense. They belong to a wild landscape. Their presence supports the idea that feasting or large-scale food consumption may have been part of gatherings at the site, though the details remain debated. Were animals hunted nearby in preparation for ceremonies? Were people bringing food from different territories? Did the debris of feasts later become part of the material used to close the enclosures? The evidence remains incomplete. But the bones make one point clearly: this was not a fully agricultural city feeding itself from domestic herds and fields. It belonged to a threshold world. The tools reinforce that picture. Flint blades, scrapers, points, and other artifacts reveal skilled stoneworking traditions. Grinding stones and plant processing equipment suggest the handling of wild cereals and other plant foods. This is one of the lesser-known but essential details. Göbekli Tepe is not only about pillars, it is also about the everyday technologies of cutting, scraping, pounding, grinding, carrying, and preparing. Monumental architecture can make the builders seem almost abstract, as if they were a mysterious force rather than people with sore hands and meals to prepare. But every carved animal and raised pillar was supported by a practical world of tools, food, water, and repeated labor. Early interpretations emphasized Göbekli Tepe as a sanctuary, a place apart from ordinary settlement. That view became famous because it sharpened the paradox: temples before towns, ritual before agriculture, monument before village. Yet later work at the site and nearby places has complicated the picture. Archaeologists have identified domestic or domestic-like structures in the broader region, and even at Göbekli Tepe itself, interpretation has become more cautious. The site may not have been purely separate from habitation in every phase. It may have included a mixture of special buildings, work areas, and forms of occupation that do not fit neatly into modern categories. What once looked like a clean contrast between Sacred Hill and ordinary village now appears more tangled. That does not make the site less important. It makes it more human. Because humans rarely divide life as neatly as archaeologists do. A place of ritual may also be a place of food preparation. A gathering centre may also host temporary residents. A building used for ceremony may be repaired by people who sleep nearby. A structure that later scholars call religious may also organize politics, exchange, marriage, memory, and labor. The word temple may help, but it can also mislead, because it carries the weight of later religions, priesthoods, and formal institutions. At Göbekli Tepe, the categories are older than the words available for them. The buried stone rings under the soil therefore reveal more than architecture. They reveal a problem of translation across time. The excavators uncover pillars and walls, but what they are really trying to reach is a vanished system of meaning. Each stone ring is both physical and social. It marks a place where people came together under rules we do not know, around images we cannot fully read, for purposes that may as join death, animals, landscape, season, ancestry, danger, and identity into one living pattern. Some carvings are vivid enough to feel immediate, yet their meanings slip away the moment one tries to fix them. A fox may be a fox, but it may also be a clan sign, a mythic trickster, a guardian, a dangerous presence, a seasonal marker, or something no later category captures. A vulture may be a bird, but in many ancient symbolic systems, birds that interact with bodies and bones become linked with death, transformation, or the sky at Göbekli Tepe. Such interpretations are possible, even tempting, but certainty remains out of reach. That is part of the site's power. It gives enough evidence to overturn old assumptions, but not enough to replace them with a simple new story. It shows that people at the dawn of the Neolithic could create monumental ceremonial landscapes. It shows that pre-urban societies could coordinate remarkable labour. It shows that symbolic life was not a decorative extra added after survival was solved. But it does not tell us exactly who led the work, how decisions were made, whether some people held more power than others, whether the central pillars represented ancestors or other beings, or why the enclosures were eventually buried. The deeper archaeologists dig, the more precise some answers become, and the more refined the mysteries grow. The hill that once seemed ordinary had become a machine for rearranging time. Under its soil, the expected order of civilization was no longer secure. The first streets were still far in the future. The first written names were still unimaginable. Yet here were rings of stone built with intention, filled with animals, sealed by human hands, and preserved inside a mound like a memory too heavy to carry forward openly. Göbekli Tepe had waited for thousands of years not because it had nothing to say, but because its language was not one the modern world was prepared to hear. The hands that built Göbekli Tepe are everywhere and nowhere. They are in the chisel marks, in the quarry scars, in the smoothed limestone surfaces, in the careful cutting of animal bodies from stone, in the rubble used to seal the enclosures, in the flint blades and grinding stones, in the animal bones left behind after meals whose meanings are lost. Yet the people themselves remain almost unreachable. No written account names them. No king claims the hill. No inscription records a dedication. No carved face looks out and says, "This is who we were." The builders stand behind their work like figures behind a curtain, visible only through the movements they left in matter. They lived in a world before the ordinary signs of city life, but not before society. This distinction matters. It is easy to imagine that because Göbekli Tepe predates urban civilization, its makers must have been simple in every way that counts. But the stones argue otherwise. A group does not cut and raise pillars by accident. It does not carve dangerous animals into limestone without a shared visual language. It does not return again and again to the same hill unless that hill has a place in memory. whatever their exact way of life, the builders belong to networks of knowledge, obligation, skill, and belief. They were not citizens in a city, but they are not isolated wanderers drifting without structure through the landscape. Most evidence points to people still deeply engaged in hunting and gathering, though the region was approaching the great transformation toward farming. They likely moved through a seasonal world, following the availability of plants, animals, water, and social gatherings. Some may have lived in nearby settlements for much of the year. Others may have travelled from farther away for special events. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate how permanent occupation at the hill itself really was in its earliest phases. But the image of purely wandering bands suddenly pausing to build a massive sanctuary is probably too simple. So is the image of a fully settled town building its central temple. Göbekli Tepe belongs to the difficult middle ground, where mobility and attachment overlap. This middle ground may have been one of the most creative periods in human history. People knew the habits of wild cereals well enough to harvest them intensively. They understood stone, bone, wood, hide, fibre, and fire. They made tools not as crude improvisations, but as refined technologies passed through generations. Flint knappers could strike long blades from prepared cores with precision. Hunters knew the strengths and weaknesses of gazelle, boar, wild sheep, and aurochs. Gatherers knew when seeds were worth collecting, when nuts ripened, which plants could heal, poison, dye, bind, season, or burn. Children learned landscapes through walking them, not reading them. Memory was practical, but it was also social. To forget a water source, a migration route, or a dangerous slope could matter as much as forgetting a law in a later city. The work of building the enclosures required another layer of knowledge. Limestone had to be selected, the bedrock had to be cut, pillars had to be shaped before transport or perhaps refined after being moved. Ropes, levers, sledges, ramps, wooden supports, and packed earth may have been used, though the exact methods remain inferred rather than directly preserved. The people doing this work did not need metal. They needed experience, patience, and coordination. A stone weighing several tons is not mysterious because it is impossible to move. It is mysterious because moving it safely requires people to act together around a shared plan. Someone had to know where the pillar should go. Someone had to organize the labor. Someone had to maintain the reason for doing it when the work became difficult, slow, and dangerous. That last requirement may be the most important. Labor is not only a technical problem, it is a social one. People can be forced to work, but there is little evidence here for the kinds of coercive states that later organize labor with taxation, soldiers, and administrators. People can also work because of kinship obligations, ritual duty, competition, feasting, grief, initiation, alliance, or the desire to belong to something larger than a household. The builders of Göbekli Tepe may have lived in societies where leadership was temporary, situational, or based on persuasion rather than permanent office. A skilled ritual specialist, elder, hunter, organizer, or lineage leader could gather people for a project without being a king. No single explanation fully accounts for the scale and repetition of the building, but the stones suggest social power before formal state power. The human body is quietly present in the pillars themselves. The T-shape is not just architectural. On some central pillars, carved arms run down the sides, bending toward hands placed near the front of the body. Belts and hanging animal skins or cloth-like forms appear. These details make the stones feel like stylized persons, not merely supports. Yet their facelessness keeps them distant. They may represent powerful ancestors, supernatural beings, ritualized human figures, or a category of presence now impossible to translate. What survives in the record suggests that the builders understood identity in ways that did not require portraiture. A being could be marked by posture, clothing, gesture, animal association, or placement within a sacred arrangement. A face was not necessary, or perhaps not allowed. One surprising detail is how often the imagery of Göbekli Tepe avoids the calm domestic animals that later define Neolithic life. These are not gentle sheep in fenced pens or cattle reduced to property. The carved world is crowded with wilderness snakes, foxes, boars, vultures, scorpions, spiders or insects, birds, and powerful mammals. Many are creatures that bite, sting, scavenge, flee, or threaten. This does not mean the site was dedicated to fear, but it suggests a symbolic world in which danger mattered. The builders may have been representing animals they hunted, avoided, admired, feared, or associated with death and transformation. They lived before humans had fully remade these species into domestic companions and commodities. The animal world still pressed close with its own agency. The people who carved those animals knew them intimately. A fox is not an abstract emblem to a hunter who has watched it move at dawn. A boar is not a decorative motif to someone who understands how violently it can charge from brush. A vulture is not merely a bird when it appears where flesh becomes bone. The carvings may look stylized, but they are not careless. Some animals seem to have been chosen because of how they occupy boundaries, earth and sky, life and death, settlement and wild land, visible and hidden places. Scholars still debate these interpretations, and caution is necessary, but the pattern is difficult to ignore. Göbekli Tepe's art does not present a peaceful farm world. It presents a charged landscape of beings. Daily life around such monument building would have been both ordinary and extraordinary. Someone had to fetch water, someone had to prepare food, someone had to repair tools, cut hides, gather fuel, carry baskets, tend fires, remove debris, and manage children. Large gatherings are never only symbolic, they are logistical events. If people assembled at Göbekli Tepe for feasts or ceremonies, they needed meat, plant foods, containers, grinding stones, cutting tools, and space without pottery. Liquids and prepared foods could still be stored and served in stone vessels, skins, baskets sealed with pitch, wooden containers, or other perishable materials that rarely survive. Much of their material world has disappeared, making their lives seem stonier and more austere than they probably were. The absence of surviving textiles, baskets, wooden structures, and painted surfaces is one of archaeology's great distortions. A person from Göbekli Tepe's world may have been surrounded by colour, smell, fibre, smoke, sound, and movement. Clothing could have included skins, woven plant fibres, ornaments of shell, stone, bone, or teeth. Bodies may have been painted or scarred. Ritual spaces may have been marked with perishable objects that vanished completely. The limestone pillars dominate because stone endures, but stone was only one part of the world. The original enclosures may have been visually richer than their excavated remains suggest. What did these people believe? The honest answer is that no one knows in detail. Terms like religion, temple, priest, and God are useful but dangerous. They come from later worlds, from societies with texts, institutions, and named pantheons. At Göbekli Tepe, belief may have been inseparable from hunting success, ancestry, death, territorial memory, seasonal return, and social alliance. The builders may not have divided sacred and practical life in the way modern observers often do. A feast could be political, religious, economic, and emotional at once. A pillar could be an ancestor, a marker, a being, a story, and a social contract. The categories overlap because human life overlaps. There are hints that death may have been important. In the broader pre-pottery Neolithic of the region, human skulls and ancestor-focused practices appear at some sites, and later, Neolithic communities sometimes removed, curated, plastered, or reburied skulls in complex ways. At Göbekli Tepe itself, fragments of human bone, some bearing cut marks or modification, have encouraged discussion about mortuary practices, excarnation, or the special treatment of remains. The evidence is fragmentary and should not be overbuilt into a complete ritual system. Still, combined with vulture imagery and the monumental setting, it suggests that the boundary between the living and the dead may have mattered deeply. The hill may have been a place where memory of the dead helped organize the living. If so, then the builders were doing something that later civilizations would also do in different forms. They were using architecture to make memory durable. A body dies, a spoken story changes, a gathering disperses, but stone remains, especially when raised on a hill visible across the landscape. The great pillars may have allowed communities to return to something stable in a changing world. Climate was shifting. Plant and animal distributions were changing. People were experimenting with new ways of staying, gathering, storing, and belonging. In such a time, a monumental centre could hold memory in place. And still, they were not yet city people. That is what makes them so important. They stand between worlds, not Paleolithic cave painters exactly, not Neolithic farmers in the later village sense, not urban citizens, not nomads in the simplistic sense. They are people of a threshold, and thresholds are often where old categories fail. They could move through wild landscapes and still build fixed monuments. They could hunt and gather and still organize large communal projects. They could lack writing and still create symbolic systems sophisticated enough to puzzle scholars 11,000 years later. They could live before cities and yet help invent the kind of shared centre from which cities would eventually grow. The hands without a city built more than stone rings. They built a problem for the future. They remind us that civilization did not begin when human minds suddenly became capable of complexity. The capacity was already there, waiting for conditions, pressures, opportunities, and desires to assemble in new ways. Göbekli Tepe is one of those assemblies, a place where labour, wild food, ritual, memory, and landscape converged before the familiar structures of history had formed around them. The builders left no names, but they left a question cut into limestone: how much of what makes a civilization begins before anyone has built a city at all. The animals come out of the stone as if they've been waiting there longer than the hill itself. A fox stretches across a pillar with its narrow body and alert posture. Snakes ripple in lines, sometimes many at once, like a living current of danger. A boar appears with bristling force, compact and violent. Birds stand with long legs and sharp profiles. A scorpion spreads its claws and tail, unmistakable even after 11,000 years. There are spiders or insects, cranes or water birds, wild cattle, gazelle, perhaps leopards or felines, though some identifications remain debated. The carvings are not random decorations scattered across architecture. They are placed with intention, cut into the faces and sides of pillars that already seem to represent beings. The result is a stone world crowded by creatures, a silent assembly of animals surrounding figures that may be human, superhuman, ancestral, or something for which no modern word fits comfortably. At first glance, the carvings can feel almost readable. A snake is danger, a vulture is death, a fox is cunning, a boar is aggression, a scorpion is poison. It is tempting to treat the imagery as a code and assign each animal a meaning, as though the whole sight were a dictionary that only needs translation. But this temptation is exactly where caution becomes necessary. Symbols do not carry the same meanings everywhere. A creature feared in one society may be revered in another. An animal hunted for food may also be a mythic ancestor. A scavenger may be unclean in one tradition and sacred in another. Scholars still debate the meanings of the carvings because the images survive without the stories that once held them together. The animals are vivid, but their grammar is missing. What can be said with more confidence is that the builders chose a mostly wild bestiary. These are not the calm domestic scenes that later agricultural societies often leave behind. There are no neat processions of plough oxen, no herds under human control, no obvious celebration of sheepfolds, granaries, or farming abundance. The carved creatures belong to a world not yet subdued. They bite, run, sting, scavenge, stalk, and watch. They come from brush, steppe, river margins, cliffs, burrows, and sky. Many are animals that occupy edges, snakes disappearing into holes, birds moving between earth and air, vultures crossing between the living body and exposed bone, foxes slipping between human camp and wild dark. This does not prove a single doctrine, but it suggests a symbolic universe in which the wild remained powerful, close, and morally charged. The people who made these carvings knew these animals not as illustrations but as neighbours. The distinction matters. In the modern world, many people meet wild animals through screens, signs, museums, or managed encounters. At Göbekli Tepe, animal knowledge was intimate and practical. The track of a gazelle, the scent of boar, the call of cranes, the circling of vultures, the sudden movement of a snake in grass, the presence of foxes near scraps after a feast. These were part of lived experience. A carved animal could hold layers of recognition that are difficult to recover because the people who made it did not need to explain what everyone around them already knew. Some of the most striking images appear on the pillars themselves, and their placement may be as important as their form. Animals crawl up vertical surfaces or move across the body of the stone. On certain pillars, snakes gather in dense groups, like a swarm or pattern. On another famous pillar, often called Pillar 43, a vulture-like bird appears near a headless human figure, alongside other animals and abstract signs. This has generated intense discussion. Some researchers see possible references to death, excarnation, or the journey of the dead. Others have proposed astronomical interpretations, reading the animals as constellations or sky markers. More cautious scholars warn that such readings can move too quickly from resemblance to certainty. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for the panel without risk of overinterpretation. Still, the vulture is hard to ignore. Across many regions of the ancient Near East, birds associated with carrion later become linked to death and transformation, though one must be careful not to project later beliefs backward automatically. In a world where bodies might be exposed, defleshed, or treated in complex mortuary rites, a vulture is not simply a bird. It is an agent of transition. It turns flesh into bone. It moves between the ground and the sky. It appears where death becomes something else. At Göbekli Tepe, and in the broader early Neolithic, human remains sometimes show signs of special treatment, and skull-focused practices become important at several sites in the region. The details differ, and direct connections cannot always be proven, but the recurrence of death-related imagery and modified human bone suggests that the dead were not merely disposed of and forgotten. They may have been active presences in social memory. The snakes carry a different kind of unease. They appear often, sometimes arranged in groups, sometimes curving with a simple but unmistakable energy. A snake can be dangerous, but it is also regenerative in many symbolic systems because it sheds its skin. It moves without limbs, enters the earth, appears suddenly, and disappears just as quickly. It lives close to the ground, and yet seems almost liquid. Did the builders see snakes as guardians, threats, ancestors, underworld beings, seasonal signs, or symbols of renewal? The honest answer is unknown. What survives in the record suggests that they mattered enough to be repeated, and repetition is rarely accidental in symbolic art. Foxes are among the most compelling animals at the site. They appear frequently and prominently, sometimes carved on pillars that also carry human-like features. In later folklore across many cultures, foxes often become tricksters or boundary crossers. But again, later analogy must be handled carefully. In the world of Göbekli Tepe, foxes may have been valued for their alertness, their nighttime movement, their closeness to human refuse, or their role in stories now lost. Some scholars have wondered whether different animals might mark different groups, clans, lineages, or ritual identities. This is possible, but difficult to prove. If people travelled from various communities to gather at the hill, animal emblems could have helped organise social difference, yet they could just as easily belong to mythic sequences, ritual roles, or cosmological categories. The wild boar offers a more physical kind of symbolism. Anyone who has encountered a boar in dense cover knows that the animal does not need myth to be formidable. It is muscular, fast, armed, and unpredictable. Its presence in the carvings and in animal bone assemblages links image and subsistence, but not in a simple way. A hunted animal can be food, danger, prestige, and symbol at once. To kill a large or dangerous animal may produce meat, but it may also produce reputation. Feasts built around such animals could carry social weight. The carved boar may therefore belong to the same world as the bones in the fill, a world where eating, hunting, memory, and display overlap. There are also abstract marks, signs that resist easy identification. Some may be simple shapes, some have been compared to letters, though that comparison is misleading because writing is not present here in the later sense. These marks may have been symbols, ownership signs, counting devices, ritual motifs, or parts of a visual language that did not develop into writing as we understand it. Their existence is important because it shows that the imagery was not limited to recognizable animals. The builders also used forms whose meaning depended on convention. A sign does not have to be writing to be meaningful. It only has to be recognized by the people who use it. This opens a larger possibility. Göbekli Tepe's carvings may not be pictures in the modern decorative sense, but components of a performed environment. The enclosures may have been seen in motion, by firelight, in gatherings where stories, chants, gestures, costumes, or body paint activated the imagery. A pillar that seems mute in a museum photograph may have once stood among moving bodies, smoke, animal skins, the smell of roasted meat, and the tension of restricted knowledge. Some carvings are low relief, subtle enough that changing light would alter their visibility. Dawn, dusk, torchlight, or shadow could make animals appear and disappear along the stone. The site may have been experienced less like a static monument and more like a place where images came alive under specific conditions. The central T-shaped pillars deepen this sense of presence. If they are stylized human or human-like beings, then the animals carved upon or around them may not simply decorate architecture, they may interact with bodies. A fox near a belt, a snake along a side, a dangerous creature facing inward, these relationships may have mattered. The pillars stand larger than ordinary humans, faceless yet embodied, wearing belts and perhaps garments or animal skins. Their blank heads do not look upward or outward in a human way. They simply are. Around them, the animals move. It is possible that the central pillars represent powerful beings surrounded by associated creatures. It is also possible that the pillars are not individuals but categories of being, or even monumental versions of ritual participants. The evidence does not decide the question. The difficulty is that archaeology can reveal placement but not performance. It can show that one animal appears beside another, that a pillar was set into a wall, that a carving was made before or after a surface was finished, that a structure was buried with certain materials, but it cannot easily recover the spoken myth, the rule of entry, the fear felt by a child seeing the pillars for the first time, or the authority of the person who knew which animal mattered and why. The carvings therefore sit in an uncomfortable zone too meaningful to be dismissed, too silent to be fully translated. Popular imagination often fills this silence too quickly. Some have tried to turn the animals into a star map, a warning of comet impacts, a record of a forgotten apocalypse, or evidence of knowledge from a lost advanced civilization. Such ideas can be intriguing as stories, but most remain disputed or unsupported when tested against the full archaeological context. The safer and more powerful conclusion is also the more human one. The carvings show that people at the dawn of the Neolithic possessed a rich symbolic world rooted in the animals, dangers, deaths, and transformations of their landscape. They did not need writing to think symbolically. They did not need cities to create sacred images. They did not need domesticated nature to imagine beings larger than themselves. In the end, the animals in the stone do not solve Göbekli Tepe. They keep it open. They reveal a world where the boundary between human and animal, living and dead, wild and social, visible and hidden may have been drawn differently than it is now. They remind us that before humans built cities, they were already building systems of meaning dense enough to survive only as fragments. A scorpion's tail, a fox's body, a line of snakes, a bird beside a headless figure, each is a clue, but not a confession. Together they form a chorus without words, carved into limestone by people who knew exactly what they meant, and left behind for a future that can only listen through stone. The idea is almost too neat, which is why it has to be handled carefully. Perhaps people did not first invent farming and then build places like Göbekli Tepe. Perhaps places like Göbekli Tepe helped make farming necessary. In its simplest form, this is the great reversal suggested by the hill. Instead of agriculture creating ritual centers may have pulled people together so intensely, so repeatedly, and in such numbers that new ways of producing food began to matter more than they ever had before. Bread may not have built the temple may have helped summon bread. That sentence is powerful, but it can also mislead if taken too literally. No single monument invented agriculture. No carved pillar caused wheat to change overnight. Domestication is not a moment when someone discovers farming like a tool hidden under a stone. It is a long process, made from repeated choices across generations, gathering certain plants more often, returning to productive patches, clearing or disturbing ground, carrying seeds, storing them, selecting grains that stay attached to their stalks, protecting favoured areas, and slowly altering the relationship between human hands and wild species. The evidence remains incomplete, and the shift from foraging to farming varies from place to place. But Göbekli Tepe sits exactly where the old certainty becomes unstable, because it shows that large gatherings and monumental ritual activity were already present in a world not yet fully agricultural. This matters because gathering people is expensive. A small mobile group can survive by knowing when to move, when to hunt, when to harvest, and when to disperse. A large assembly creates different pressures. Many mouths need food at the same time. People arriving from different territories need to be hosted, impressed, fed, obligated, or reconciled. If the gathering is tied to ritual, death, alliance, or seasonal ceremony, then failure to provide may not be merely inconvenient. It may be socially dangerous. A feast is never only calories, it is reputation made edible. It is generosity displayed in front of witnesses. It is a way of turning food into loyalty, memory, and power. At Göbekli Tepe, the huge quantities of wild animal bone and the presence of grinding stones and plant processing tools suggest that food preparation and consumption were woven into the life of the site. The bones mostly belong to wild species, not domestic herds, which keeps the setting firmly in that threshold world. Gazelle, wild cattle, wild boar, wild sheep, birds, and other animals appear not as distant symbols alone but as bodies processed and eaten. Wild cereals were likely gathered and ground as well. Some researchers have suggested that large stone vessels may have been used for brewing or soaking grains, perhaps even producing fermented drinks for communal events. That idea remains debated, but it fits a broader possibility at the hill. Food and ritual were not separate stories. Imagine a gathering season. People approach from different directions, following ridges, valleys, and remembered paths. Some carry tools, some bring hides, baskets, ornaments, or food. Others arrive with stories, obligations, rivalries, grief, or expectation. The hill is visible before the enclosures are reached. Smoke may rise from fires. The smell of meat, crushed grain, sweat, dust, and limestone hangs in the air. Work and ceremony blur. A group may quarry stone in one part of the hill while others prepare food, repair tools, carve surfaces, sing, mourn, compete, or watch. Children see animals cut into pillars and learn that this place is not like other places. The gathering itself becomes a force that has to be fed. If such gatherings happened repeatedly, they could change the surrounding landscape. Wild cereal stands near important places might be harvested more intensely. People might return to the same patches year after year. They might favour plants with larger grains or easier processing. They might accidentally spread seeds along paths or around camps. They might clear competing plants, disturb soil, or protect productive areas from animals. At first, none of this needs to look like farming. It is still gathering, but gathering with memory and preference. Over generations, those repeated choices can become cultivation. Cultivation can become dependence. Dependence can become domestication. The line between wild harvest and managed field is not a sharp line at the beginning. It is a slow tightening of relationship. This is where Göbekli Tepe becomes more than a mystery of architecture. It becomes part of a larger argument about desire. Humans do not change their economies only because they discover efficiency. They also change them because social life demands it. A feast may require more grain than a household would normally gather. A ritual calendar may require stored food. A monument may require workers who must be fed while not hunting or gathering for themselves. A place of pilgrimage, if that word can be used cautiously, may create seasonal pressure on local resources. The need to supply extraordinary events can encourage ordinary innovations. In this sense, symbolic life is not an ornament on top of survival. It can reshape survival itself. The provocative phrase often associated with Göbekli Tepe is that people may have needed civilization for religion, or religion for civilization, depending on how one frames the reversal. But even that is too rigid. What likely existed was not religion in the later institutional sense, with temples, priesthoods, doctrine, and fixed hierarchy, nor was it civilization in the urban sense. Instead, there may have been ritualized gathering, shared myth, ancestral obligation, competitive feasting, seasonal congregation, and the slow emergence of more settled habits. These things do not sit neatly before or after agriculture. They grow together, each pulling on the others. The older model imagined surplus as the key. Grow more food than you immediately need, and suddenly society can support non-farmers. But the question that follows is often neglected: why produce surplus in the first place? Surplus is useful, but it is also costly. It has to be harvested, processed, stored, defended, shared, or controlled. In many societies, a surplus becomes socially meaningful through feasts, tribute, offerings, bride wealth, debt, or ritual obligation. People may intensify production not simply because it is rational in an abstract sense, but because social worlds reward generosity, display, and accumulation. A person or group that can feed others can gain prestige. A community that can host a great event can become central. A sacred place that requires offerings can reorganize labor around itself. At Göbekli Tepe, there is no clear evidence for kings commanding such surplus, and there are no written accounts of taxation or offerings, but there is evidence for repeated labor beyond immediate subsistence. That alone implies motivation strong enough to gather people and resources. The builders were willing to spend energy on carved pillars rather than only on tools, shelters, and meals. They were willing to invest in a place that outlasted any one event. The reason may have involved ancestors, dangerous animals, death rites, initiation, social competition, or cosmology. Scholars still debate the balance among these possibilities. What matters is that the reason was strong enough to leave a hill full of stone. This reversal also changes how one imagines the first permanent settlements. Rather than simple responses to food supply, they may have formed around meaningful places: a rich spring, a burial ground, a hunting corridor, a stand of wild grain, a meeting hill, or a ritual center could draw people repeatedly until staying became easier than leaving. In the broader region, early Neolithic sites show experimentation with communal buildings, special structures, skull practices, and dense social life. Göbekli Tepe is not alone in this, though it is among the most spectacular. Its importance lies partly in showing that symbolic centers could precede or accompany the formation of fully settled village worlds. There is a quiet irony here. Farming, often described as a practical revolution, may have been entangled from the beginning with impractical desires. People did not only want food, they wanted to gather, remember, honor, compete, belong, and speak to powers beyond the ordinary. They wanted to make places matter. They wanted to turn landscapes into social and sacred maps. If producing more grain helped sustain those desires, then grain became more important. If staying near a powerful place allowed communities to maintain obligations, then settlement became more attractive. If feeding workers and visitors raised prestige, then production intensified. Practical life followed symbolic life as much as the other way around. This does not mean Göbekli Tepe was the birthplace of farming. The domestication of plants and animals was spread across a wider region and involved many communities over long periods. Some early cultivation may have occurred elsewhere before or alongside the main use of the site. The Fertile Crescent was a mosaic, not a single invention point. Climate change, population pressures, local ecology, technological knowledge, and social practice all contributed. No single explanation fully accounts for the transition. But Göbekli Tepe makes it impossible to treat belief and ceremony as late luxuries. They were already powerful at the threshold. The phrase "a temple before bread" therefore works best as a doorway, not a conclusion. It invites the mind to consider that the human past was not built from hunger alone. Hunger matters, profoundly, but so do fear, grief, awe, rivalry, memory, and the need to stand with others in a place that feels larger than daily life. Before bread became a staple of settled civilization, wild grain may have been gathered, ground, cooked, brewed, shared, and consumed in events charged with meaning. Before the field became ordinary, the feast may have made abundance necessary. Before the village became permanent, the gathering place may have taught people the power of return. And on the hill, the pillars stood through this transformation, faceless and immense. Around them, animals watched from stone. People came and went, perhaps season after season, perhaps generation after generation. They carried food up the slopes, worked limestone, processed grain, butchered wild animals, and entered spaces whose rules are lost. They may not have known they were living through one of the great turning points in human history. Almost no one inside a turning point knows its name. They were doing what their world required, what their dead demanded, what their stories made necessary, what their alliances expected. Yet from those acts, a new relationship with land and food may have tightened. The city was still far away. The farm was not yet fully itself. But on that hill, before bread ruled the human future, people were already building the kinds of obligations that would make bread indispensable. The world begins to warm, but not like a door opening cleanly into spring. It warms in pulses, hesitations, reversals, and shocks. For people living near the end of the Ice Age, climate is not a chart or a distant abstraction. It is the difference between a valley that feeds gazelle and one that empties, between grasses that return and grasses that fail, between water held in the land and water lost too soon. The great ice sheets are far away from southeastern Anatolia, but their influence reaches everywhere. Winds shift, rainfall patterns change, forests move, steppe expands and contracts, rivers alter their behavior, plants ripen in new places, animals follow food and water, and humans follow both animals and memory. Göbekli Tepe recedes during this unstable passage from the Pleistocene into the Holocene, from the last Ice Age world into the warmer epoch that still holds the present. The timing matters because this is not only a story about people deciding to build something astonishing. It is also a story about a landscape becoming newly charged with possibility. The region around the upper Euphrates and the limestone plateaus of southeastern Anatolia sits near the northern Fertile Crescent, where wild cereals and the wild ancestors of several domesticated animals already exist. As conditions shift, those resources become part of a changing human equation. The environment does not force civilization into being by itself, but it sets the stage on which human choices become more consequential. Before the warmer Holocene fully settles in, there is a final climatic interruption known as the Younger Dryas, a return to cooler and often drier conditions that begins around 12,900 years ago and ends around 11,700 years ago for communities across Southwest Asia. This interval may have made familiar resources less reliable in some areas and encouraged new strategies in others. The exact local effects varied, and scholars still debate how directly the Younger Dryas pushed people toward cultivation. It is too simple to say that bad weather invented farming. Human history rarely obeys such clean cause and effect. But climate stress can tighten the relationship between people and dependable food sources. It can make seasonal knowledge more valuable, storage more important, and repeated return to productive places more attractive. Then, as the Younger Dryas ends, warming accelerates. The Holocene begins. Rainfall and vegetation patterns shift again. Wild cereal zones expand in some places. Woodlands and parklands develop where conditions allow. Herd animals adjust their ranges. The world becomes, in many areas, richer and more predictable than it had been during harsher climatic phases, though never perfectly stable. This matters for Göbekli Tepe, because monument building requires not only desire but opportunity. People must be able to gather without starving. They must be able to invest time in stone rather than only immediate survival. They must have access to food, water, raw materials, and routes of movement. A warmer, changing landscape could have made larger gatherings more feasible, even as memories of instability may have made symbolic centres more important. The hill itself commands a wide view. This is not a trivial detail. Places chosen for repeated gathering are often visually and emotionally powerful. From Göbekli Tepe, the surrounding land opens in broad distances. The site is not hidden in a valley or tucked beside a spring in the most practical domestic position. It stands high, exposed, and visible. That choice suggests that meaning mattered as much as convenience. The builders were not merely placing structures where daily life was easiest. They were marking a place in the landscape, a place that could be seen, approached, remembered, and perhaps recognized from afar. In a changing world, such fixed points may have carried special weight. Climate change also affects time itself. For mobile foragers, time is seasonal movement, the ripening of wild grain, the birth and migration of animals, the availability of nuts and fruits, the freezing or drying of water, the return of birds, the danger of heat, the promise of rain. A major climatic transition disrupts those calendars. Some signals become unreliable, some old routes weaken, new opportunities appear. People must adapt not once, but repeatedly. An adaptation is never purely technical. It is social. Communities decide where to gather, when to disperse, whom to trust, which memories still apply, which rituals hold the world together when the world changes. This is one way to understand the emotional force of Göbekli Tepe. It may have been built not in a timeless wilderness, but in a world remembering upheaval. The end of the Ice Age was not a gentle background shift. It transformed coastlines, ecosystems, and the distribution of life across continents. Sea levels rose far away as ice melted, swallowing coastal landscapes that had once been dry land. In the Near East, rainfall and vegetation patterns moved through cycles that affected human and animal lives. The builders of Göbekli Tepe did not need to understand global climate to experience local change. They would have known when familiar plants grew differently, when herds appeared in altered numbers, when water sources changed, when old knowledge needed adjustment. The surprising detail is that the birth of monumentality here may not reflect a world becoming simple and safe, but a world becoming newly unpredictable in ways that required stronger social anchors. A stable environment can support tradition, A changing environment can intensify the need for gathering, exchange, marriage networks, shared information, and ritual renewal. If one group's territory suffers, ties to another group may matter. If resources vary, gatherings can help redistribute knowledge and obligation. A monumental centre can become a social insurance system as much as a sacred place. No single explanation fully accounts for the site, but environmental instability makes the social power of gathering easier to understand. The wild cereals of the region stand at the heart of this transformation. Before domestication, they are already valuable. Their seeds can be harvested, ground, cooked, and stored. But wild cereals have their own logic. Their seed heads shatter naturally, scattering grain when ripe. For humans, this makes harvesting more difficult unless timing is precise. Over generations, people who collect, transport, and perhaps sow grains may unintentionally favor plants whose seeds remain attached longer. That trait, useful to human harvesters but disadvantageous in the wild, becomes one of the markers of domestication. This is not a conscious invention in the modern sense. It is an evolutionary partnership built through repeated human behavior. The climate creates opportunities. People create habits. Plants respond across generations. Animals, too, are part of the warming world. Gazelle herds, wild sheep, goats, boar, and aurochs move through habitats shaped by climate and vegetation. Hunting remains central at Göbekli Tepe, but the broader region eventually becomes one of the great zones of animal domestication. The shift from hunting wild animals to managing herds is not immediate, and it does not happen uniformly. It requires changes in human attention, keeping animals near, controlling breeding, protecting young, tolerating proximity, and reshaping landscapes around movement and pasture. At Göbekli Tepe's earliest phases, this future is not yet fully visible, but the ingredients are nearby. The wild world carved on the pillars is the same world from which domesticated life will slowly be drawn. There is a tension here that gives the site much of its power. The carvings celebrate or invoke wild creatures at the very edge of the age when humans will begin bringing certain species under long-term control. Snakes, foxes, boars, vultures, and scorpions remain untamed symbols, while sheep, goats, pigs, cattle, wheat, and barley are moving slowly toward domesticated futures. The hill belongs to the hinge between reverence for wild power and the first steps toward managing life. The builders may not have seen it that way. To them, the world was simply the world. But from a distance of 11 millennia, Göbekli Tepe appears at the moment before the human relationship with nature begins to change at a planetary scale. The Holocene will eventually become the epoch of farms, villages, cities, states, empires, and industrial worlds. But at its beginning, none of that is guaranteed. The warmer climate offers possibilities, not destiny. Many groups continue foraging. Some settle. Some cultivate without fully domesticating. Some adopt herding later. Some resist or abandon new practices. The movement toward agriculture is uneven, reversible in places, and deeply local. This is why Göbekli Tepe should not be treated as a simple origin point. It is better understood as one luminous node in a wide field of experimentation. Around it, communities are testing new relationships with place, food, memory, and one another. The world begins to warm, and the hill gathers meaning. Perhaps people come because the landscape is rich. Perhaps they come because old patterns have become uncertain. Perhaps they come because ancestors, stories, or dangerous beings are believed to reside there. Perhaps they come because other people come, and the gathering itself becomes the reason. These possibilities are not mutually exclusive. In human life, practical and symbolic motives rarely stay apart. A place with good access to wild resources can become sacred. A sacred place can encourage intensified food production. A changing climate can make social gathering more necessary. A feast can become a technology of survival. A monument can become a map of belonging. The warming world also helps explain why Göbekli Tepe is not followed simply by more and bigger versions of itself forever. The same transformations that make such gatherings possible also lead toward new forms of life. As cultivation spreads and settlements become more permanent, social energy shifts. Communal buildings appear in different forms. Domestic architecture becomes more prominent. Animals and plants slowly move into human-managed systems. The wild bestiary of Göbekli Tepe belongs to a moment before the farm fully reorganizes imagination. Later communities will still build sacred spaces, but the relationship between people, food, and power will change. The hill is not the beginning of a straight road. It is a flare at the edge of a turning world. And so the climate story does not reduce the mystery, it deepens it. The end of the Ice Age provides conditions, pressures, and opportunities, but it does not carve foxes into stone. Rainfall does not raise pillars, wild wheat does not bury enclosures. Human beings do that, responding to a landscape that is changing beneath them and to a social world changing within them. Göbekli Tepe is not simply a product of warming. It is a human answer to warming, instability, abundance, memory, and desire, all compressed into limestone on a hilltop. The first cities are still distant. The first farmers are only beginning to reshape the land. But the old Ice Age world is loosening, and something new is gathering in its cracks. On the plateau, the pillars stand while climates turn, animals move, grasses ripen, and people learn, season by season, that returning to the same place can change everything. If the pillars are the bones of Göbekli Tepe, then the feasts are its vanished flesh. Stone gives the site its shape, but food may have given it motion. Every enclosure, every carved animal, every raised pillar implies people gathered in numbers large enough to matter, and whenever people gather, they must eat. The hill was not sustained by symbolism alone. It required bodies, and bodies require calories, water, tools, fuel, time, and social permission. The great mystery of the place is therefore not only how people built it, but how they made the gathering itself possible. A monument can be imagined in a mind, but it can only be built by fed hands. The archaeological record preserves this practical side in fragments. There are animal bones in abundance, mostly from wild species. There are flint tools for cutting, scraping, and processing. There are grinding stones and other equipment that point toward the preparation of plant foods, likely including wild cereals. There are large stone vessels that may have held liquids or processed foods, though their exact use remains debated. Together, these traces suggest that Göbekli Tepe was not a silent shrine visited by a few specialists in isolation. It was a place of activity, consumption, and repeated human presence. What survives in the record suggests gatherings where labour, ritual, and food were bound together. Feasting is one of the most underrated forces in human history. It sounds almost too ordinary beside carved pillars and prehistoric mysteries, but feasts can reshape societies. A feast gathers people who might otherwise remain scattered. It creates obligations that outlast the meal. It allows hosts to display generosity and power. It settles tensions, marks alliances, honours the dead, welcomes outsiders, excludes rivals, and turns food into memory. In a world without writing, a feast can be a contract witnessed by everyone present. The meat is eaten, the grain is consumed, the drink is shared, but the obligation remains. At Göbekli Tepe, this matters because no obvious state machinery stands behind the labour. There are no tax tablets, no barracks, no palace storerooms, no royal tomb announcing a central authority. If people gathered to quarry, carve, transport, raise, repair, or bury pillars, something had to bring them there and keep them working. Feasting may have been one of the tools that made cooperation possible, not the only tool, and not necessarily separate from belief, but a powerful one. A group that could provide food for workers and visitors could gather prestige. A ritual leader, lineage, or community that hosted successfully could strengthen its position. The work of building could be repaid not in wages, but in meat, grain, belonging, and sacred obligation. The animals eaten at the site seem to come largely from a wild world. Gazelle appear prominently in many discussions of the faunal remains, along with wild cattle, wild boar, wild sheep, birds, foxes, hares, and other species depending on context and layer. This does not look like the food waste of a mature farming village with domestic herds. It looks like the remains of skilled hunters drawing on a rich landscape. Hunting for a gathering, however, is different from hunting for a household. To feed many people at once, hunters may need coordination, timing, and knowledge of herd movement. A successful communal hunt can itself become ceremonial, filled with danger, reputation, and story. When the animal is brought back, butchered, cooked, and shared, the hunt becomes part of the gathering's memory. Wild cattle, or aurochs, would have carried particular force. These were not the docile cattle of later fields. They were large, powerful animals, capable of killing a person. Bringing down such an animal would have required skill and nerve, and its meat could feed many. Even if aurochs were not the most common food remains in every layer, their symbolic presence across early Neolithic sites is striking. The same is true for boar, an animal whose danger is concentrated in muscle, speed, and tusk. Meat from such creatures does more than fill stomachs. It gives a feast a story. People remember who faced the animal, who struck it, who failed, who distributed the portions, who received the honoured cuts. Plant foods were likely just as important, though less dramatic to imagine. Wild cereals had to be harvested, transported, processed, ground, mixed, cooked, or perhaps fermented. Grinding is hard work. It leaves marks on stone and strain in the body. The presence of grinding equipment reminds us that the monumental world depended on repetitive labour often less visible than quarrying pillars. Someone spent hours reducing grain to usable food. Someone gathered fuel and tended heat. Someone carried water. Someone cleaned vessels. The spectacular architecture rested on countless ordinary actions, many of them performed by people whose labour rarely becomes the centre of archaeological storytelling. The possibility of fermented drink has attracted attention because alcohol, in many human societies, plays a role in feasting, ritual, and social bonding. Large stone containers from Göbekli Tepe have been discussed in this context, and residues or useware have been interpreted cautiously by some researchers as possible evidence for brewing-like activities. But this remains uncertain. It is safer to say that the processing of grains and liquids may have been significant, and that communal consumption could have included foods or drinks prepared in ways that were socially meaningful. If fermentation was involved, it would not be surprising, but it should not be treated as proven beyond debate. The evidence remains incomplete. Food also connects the living with the dead. In many societies, feasts accompany funerals, ancestor rites, renewals of sacred spaces, and acts of closure. Göbekli Tepe's deliberate backfilling raises the possibility that some deposits were not mere trash, but meaningful material. Animal bones, stone chips, tools, and soil packed into enclosures may represent cleanup, construction debris, ritual closure, or a mixture of all three. Archaeology often struggles to separate refuse from offering because human beings do not always separate them cleanly. A bone thrown into a fill may be garbage in one sense and part of a closing act in another. The same meal can be practical, sacred, and political at once. Death hovers at the edges of the site. Human bone fragments, including pieces that may show modification, have led researchers to consider whether the hill was connected to mortuary practices. Vulture imagery strengthens that possibility, though it does not prove a single ritual. In the wider early Neolithic world of the Near East, the dead are often treated in ways that show continuing social importance. Skulls may be removed, curated, plastered, displayed, or reburied. Bodies may be buried beneath floors. Ancestors become part of houses and communities. Göbekli Tepe's exact role in this broader mortuary landscape is still debated, but it likely belonged to a world where death did not end social presence. A feast for the dead is also a feast for the living. The dead may authorize the gathering, but the living eat the meat, form the alliances, renew the obligations, and remember who stood where. If ancestors or powerful beings were believed to inhabit the pillars, then feeding people near those pillars could bind human communities to more than human presences. The act of sharing food under the gaze of carved animals and faceless stones would have made memory physical. People would not simply remember an idea. They would remember the taste of meat, the heat of fires, the weight of work, the sight of the hill, the arrangement of bodies inside the enclosure, the feeling of being part of something larger than daily survival. This is one of the ways monument building creates society. It does not only express a community that already exists, it helps produce that community. People who work together become people who can say they work together. People who eat together become bound by the meal. People who return to the same place inherit stories of previous gatherings. Children who accompany adults to the hill grow into adults for whom the hill has always mattered. Over generations, the site becomes a social memory machine. It gathers labor and gives back identity. The surprising detail is that such social complexity does not require a city. It requires repetition, shared symbols, and enough trust or pressure to bring people back. A mobile or semi-mobile world can still have fixed centers. A society without writing can still remember obligations through ceremony. A people without domestic herds can still produce surplus for special moments by hunting, gathering, storing, and coordinating. The absence of urban institutions does not mean the absence of power. Power may have lived in the ability to gather, to host, to interpret signs, to connect the living with the dead, and to decide when a stone enclosure had completed its life. There may have been tensions too. Large gatherings are not automatically harmonious. They bring together groups with different interests. They create opportunities for alliance, but also rivalry. Feasts can display generosity, but they can also humiliate those who cannot reciprocate. Labor can unite, but it can also expose inequality. A person or group who controls ritual knowledge or access to a sacred enclosure may gain influence. A host who feeds many may become difficult to ignore. Göbekli Tepe may therefore preserve the early stirrings of social differentiation, though evidence for formal hierarchy remains debated. The site does not show kings. but it may show the conditions from which more durable leadership could eventually emerge. To stand inside one of the enclosures in imagination is to sense how food, stone, and human presence might have converged. The central pillars rise above the people. Around the walls, other pillars hold their animals in silence. Fires burn somewhere nearby. Meat is cut. Grain is ground. Tools are resharpened. Old stories are repeated. New alliances are made. Perhaps the dead are invoked. Perhaps dangerous animals are remembered. Perhaps the work of the day has been brutal. And the meal is both reward and obligation. No written liturgy survives. No single explanation fully accounts for the scene. But the remains make clear that the hill was not empty symbolism. It was a lived event. And after the feast, something remains. Bones are discarded or deposited. Tools break. Stone chips accumulate. Ash cools. Footprints vanish. The people leave, or some stay, or others arrive. The pillars remain. They hold the memory longer than any body can. Over time, the repeated gatherings build more than architecture. They build expectation. They teach people that this hill is where labor becomes meaning, where food becomes obligation, where the dead and living may share a landscape, where wild animals carved in stone witness human society becoming something new. Before cities have markets, temples and granaries, Göbekli Tepe shows an earlier kind of centre. It is a place where people may have learned the power of assembling bodies, food, memory, and stone into a single event. The feast ends, but the need to gather returns, and with every return, the hill becomes harder to leave behind. Göbekli Tepe feels singular because it was the first to seize the modern imagination. But the hill is not alone. Once the eye learns what to look for, the wider landscape begins to change. Across the limestone uplands of southeastern Anatolia, other sites appear like half-buried relatives, some known for decades, others newly investigated, each adding pressure to the same conclusion: this was not one miraculous monument rising from an empty world. It was part of a broader ancient landscape of gathering places, special buildings, carved stones, settlements, and symbolic experiments. The city before cities was not a lone spark in darkness. It belonged to a constellation. One of the most important names in the constellation is Karahan Tepe. Like Göbekli Tepe, it lies in the region of Şanlıurfa, and like Göbekli Tepe, it has revealed T-shaped pillars and monumental architecture belonging to the early Neolithic world. But Karahan Tepe is not a simple copy. Its spaces, carvings, and built forms show their own character. One of its most striking features is a rock-cut chamber containing pillars and a carved human head emerging from the stone. A haunting image that feels more bodily and enclosed than the open monumental rings of Göbekli Tepe. Nearby, a series of upright stone elements rise from the bedrock, sometimes described as phallic or pillar-like forms, though interpretations remain cautious. The site seems to speak the same broad symbolic language as Göbekli Tepe, but in a different dialect. This matters because a single extraordinary site can always be treated as an exception. Exceptions are easier to isolate. They can be explained as accidents, local genius, or unusual ritual intensity. But multiple related sites force a larger interpretation if Göbekli Tepe, Karahan Tepe, Nevali Chori, Sayburç, Sefer Tepe, Harbetsuvan, and other places across the Taştepeler region share elements of architecture and imagery. Then the question changes. It is no longer only why one hill was built before cities. It is why a whole region became a laboratory for monumental and symbolic construction at the dawn of settled life. The phrase Taştepeler means stone hills, and it has become a useful way of thinking about this broader landscape. These sites are not identical, and they should not be flattened into one culture with one meaning. Some preserve large special buildings, others show domestic structures, communal spaces, carved benches, reliefs, pillars, or human and animal imagery. Some were excavated earlier and later flooded, such as Nivali Chori, which revealed T-shaped pillars in a settlement context before Göbekli Tepe became famous. Others are still being explored, and their full significance remains uncertain. What survives in the record suggests a network of communities experimenting with architecture, gathering, ritual, and settlement in overlapping ways. Nivali Chori is especially important because it complicates the old separation between sanctuary and village. Excavated before being inundated by the waters of the Ataturk Dam, the site contained rectangular buildings, domestic architecture, and a special structure with T-shaped pillars. This showed that such pillars were not exclusive to an isolated hilltop sanctuary. They could appear within or near settlement contexts. The implication is subtle but crucial. The symbolic world seen at Göbekli Tepe may have been part of everyday community life in the wider region, even if Göbekli Tepe itself had special prominence. Ritual was not necessarily far away from residents. The sacred and the domestic may have shared walls, paths, and labour. Karahan Tepe pushes the story further. Its architecture suggests complex planning and repeated use, and its imagery includes human forms more direct than many at Göbekli Tepe. A carved human figure from nearby Sayburç, shown gripping its body in a scene with dangerous animals, has also attracted attention because it appears to present a narrative or staged relationship between humans and beasts. Such images hint at mythic scenes, social memory, or ritual stories. But again, the evidence remains incomplete. Without writing, a carved sequence can be recognized as meaningful without being translated. The figures are close enough to touch, and still too far to explain. The wider landscape also helps correct a common misunderstanding. Göbekli Tepe was never proof that a fully developed city existed before agriculture. It was proof that early Neolithic communities could create monumental places before the classic urban package. The nearby hidden settlements make this even clearer. They show a spectrum rather than a contradiction: special buildings, domestic structures, communal spaces, hunting economies, plant processing, early cultivation, symbolic carvings, and changing forms of residence all interwoven. Instead of a single leap from nomad to city, the region shows many steps taken in different orders. This is how deep history usually works. Later categories are neat because they are built from outcomes. A city is recognizable once streets, houses, workshops, walls, temples, and administrative systems stand together. A farming village is recognizable once domestic plants and animals dominate daily life. But the beginning is messier. People may build communal structures before permanent houses become widespread. They may cultivate some plants while still relying heavily on hunting. They may gather seasonally at a ritual center while living elsewhere part of the year. They may create symbolic architecture without formal political hierarchy. They may abandon one experiment and intensify another. The Taş Tepeler sites preserve this messiness, and that is their value. There is another important detail. Many of these sites are located in a landscape rich in limestone bedrock. The stone itself made certain architectural choices possible. Pillars could be cut from local rock. Bedrock could be shaped into basins, benches, channels, or chambers. The landscape offered both material and meaning. Builders did not import their monumentality from nowhere. They drew it out of the ground beneath their feet. At Karahan Tepe, the use of bedrock feels especially intimate, as if architecture and geology merge. At Göbekli Tepe, unfinished pillars in nearby quarries show the same relationship between natural hill and human form. The people were not simply placing buildings on a landscape, they were transforming the landscape into social memory. The sites also suggest communication across communities. Similar pillar forms, animal motifs, and architectural choices imply that ideas moved. People may have travelled between places, intermarried, exchanged goods, shared rituals, competed, or recognized one another through symbols. This does not require a centralized authority. Networks can spread styles and practices without kings. A successful ritual form at one place can inspire another. A powerful animal symbol can be adopted, altered, or contested. A building technique can travel with skilled workers or through observation. The region may have been alive with such exchanges, a prehistoric conversation conducted in stone, movement, and ceremony. Yet local differences matter just as much. Karahan Tepe's carved head and rock-cut chamber are not the same as Göbekli Tepe's great circular enclosures. Sayburch's reliefs are not identical to the animal panels of Göbekli Tepe. Navali Chori's special building sits in a settlement context that changes how one thinks about the pillars. These differences suggest that communities were not merely copying a blueprint. They were adapting shared forms to local histories and needs. The symbolic system was flexible, which may explain its power. It could connect communities while allowing each place to remain distinct. As more sites are studied, interpretations of Göbekli Tepe have become more grounded and more complex. The early image of an isolated hunter-gatherer temple has softened. Archaeologists now ask whether the site included domestic activity, whether some buildings had mixed functions, whether people lived near or within the mound in ways not initially recognized, and how different phases changed over time. The mystery has not disappeared. It has matured. A lone miracle has become part of a regional transformation. This regional view also makes the coming rise of farming look less like a sudden invention and more like one thread in a larger reorganization of life. Communities in this area were already gathering, building, carving, feasting, and marking special places. As cultivation intensified and animals began to be managed, those changes entered an existing social world. Farming did not arrive among people without ritual, memory, or architecture. It entered a landscape already full of obligations and symbols. That may be why the transition became so consequential. New food systems attached themselves to powerful social centers and growing communities. The hidden settlements near Göbekli Tepe therefore take away one kind of mystery and replace it with another. They take away the idea that the hill was impossible, isolated, or inexplicable. They show that it belonged to a wider human pattern. But they introduce the deeper question of why this region, at this time, became so fertile in symbolic architecture. Was it the richness of wild resources, the pressures and opportunities of climate change, the density of groups meeting at ecological crossroads, the social competition created by feasting and gathering, the power of ancestor traditions? No single explanation fully accounts for it. The answer likely lies in the way all these forces overlapped. From the hilltop of Göbekli Tepe, it is possible to imagine lines running outward across the region, not roads in the later sense, but paths of memory. People move between settlements, quarries, hunting grounds, water sources, and sacred places. They carry flint, food, ornaments, stories, marriage ties, songs, fears, and obligations. They see other pillars and other carvings. They recognize some symbols and encounter others that are strange. They belong to a world larger than one camp and smaller than a state, a world held together by movement and return. The city has still not arrived, but a landscape of centers has. That may be the more important discovery. Before streets, there are paths. Before walls, there are gathering places. Before kingdoms, there are networks. Before writing, there are repeated forms that tell people where they belong. Göbekli Tepe is the most famous stone hill, but it is not the whole story. Around it, the buried settlements and sister sites reveal an ancient world learning how to make place permanent, not yet through cities, but through memory cut into stone. The problem of no houses begins with an expectation. If people built something as ambitious as Göbekli Tepe, the mind looks naturally for the settlement that supported it. It looks for streets, hearths, storage rooms, sleeping spaces, refuse pits, workshops, children's traces, domestic floors, and the ordinary clutter of daily life. Monumental places usually belong to communities that live somewhere, and the more impressive the monument, the more strongly one expects to find the living world around it. Yet for a long time, Göbekli Tepe seemed to resist that expectation. Its earliest and most famous enclosures looked less like the centre of a village and more like a special place set apart, a hilltop sanctuary without the obvious houses that would make it easy to explain. That absence became one of the site's most famous mysteries. If there were no houses, or at least no clear domestic settlement in the earliest monumental phases, then who built the pillars? Where did they live? How far did they travel? Did they come only seasonally? Was the hill a pilgrimage centre before farming, a place where dispersed hunter-gatherer groups assembled for ceremonies and feasts? This interpretation gave Göbekli Tepe much of its dramatic power. It seemed to show a temple before a town, a sacred centre before settlement, belief before bread, and in broad terms, that possibility remains important. But archaeology rarely allows an absence to stay simple. The first difficulty is that absence is not always evidence of non-existence. Houses can be hard to recognize, especially when they are built in forms archaeologists do not expect. Domestic life may use lighter materials that decay wood, reeds, hides, brush, packed earth, plaster, fibre, and other materials that leave subtler traces than limestone pillars. Later construction can disturb earlier remains. Excavation may expose monumental areas first because they are more visible, more durable, and easier to identify. A site can look like a sanctuary partly because the sanctuary survives best. The evidence remains incomplete, and every interpretation has to account for preservation as much as past behaviour. The second difficulty is that the word house carries assumptions from later settled life. A house, in a farming village or city, is usually a place of residence, storage, cooking, sleeping, family identity, and property. But at the dawn of the Neolithic, buildings may not fit so neatly. A structure can be used for seasonal sleeping, ritual preparation, tool-making, feasting, storage, or gatherings without being a house in the later domestic sense. People may live in and around special places temporarily. They may maintain buildings that are neither private homes nor public temples. The line between domestic and ritual architecture is not always clear, especially in societies where daily life and sacred obligation are tightly interwoven. Later investigations at Göbekli Tepe and comparisons with nearby sites have complicated the older picture. The mound contains not only the famous large circular enclosures, but also smaller rectangular buildings from later phases, some of which may have served more domestic or mixed functions. Archaeologists have increasingly considered the possibility that people were living at or near the site in some capacity, at least during parts of its use. The early image of an empty ritual hill visited only for ceremonies has become more cautious. What survives in the record suggests a complex sequence monumental enclosures, smaller buildings, work areas, fills, rebuilding, and changing patterns of use over time. Göbekli Tepe was not one frozen moment. It was a long-lived place, and its meaning may have changed. This matters because the phrase "before humans should have built cities" can create a false choice. Either the builders were wandering hunter-gatherers with no settlement, or they were secretly urban people whose city has not been found. The truth is likely neither. They may have belonged to communities experimenting with various degrees of settlement, mobility, and aggregation. Some people may have stayed near the hill longer than others. Some may have come for seasonal events. Some may have lived in nearby sites and visited the hill as part of a regional ritual landscape. The social world that built Göbekli Tepe may not fit the categories of nomad, villager, or urban citizen. It may sit between them. At nearby Neolithic sites, the picture becomes even more tangled. Navali Chori had domestic buildings and a special structure with T-shaped pillars. Karahan Tepe shows monumental and possibly habitation-related features. Other Tashtepela sites suggest that special buildings and settlement were part of the same broad transformation. This regional evidence weakens any overly strict division between sacred and domestic space. It suggests that the people of this world could place powerful symbolic architecture within lived landscapes, not beyond them. Göbekli Tepe may have been exceptional in scale or function, but it was not detached from human settlement as an idea. Still, the scarcity of clear early houses at the hill remains important. It prevents the site from becoming an easy village story. If a dense permanent town had surrounded the earliest enclosures, the interpretation would be simpler. The pillars could be explained as communal buildings for a local settled population, but the evidence does not yet allow that straightforward picture. Instead, Göbekli Tepe seems to belong to a form of social life where gathering could be intense, without necessarily being fully urban, or even fully permanent in the later sense. That is precisely why it matters. It shows that large-scale communal architecture does not require a city beneath it. It requires a community, but community can be distributed across a landscape. The problem also forces archaeologists to ask what domestic life looks like when it is only partly settled. A group may occupy a place for weeks or months, return every year, store tools there, repair structures, prepare food, bury or remember the dead, and still not live there continuously in the way a farming household later would. Such a place can accumulate debris and architecture without becoming a village. It can be central without being residential, or it can be residential in ways that leave weak traces. The categories blur because the lives themselves were changing. One lesser-known issue is that monumental construction can actively erase or conceal other kinds of evidence. When people quarry stone, level surfaces, build walls, dig foundations, backfill enclosures, and rebuild over earlier features, they disturb the ground. Later phases can cut through earlier occupation layers. The very activity that makes Göbekli Tepe visible may have damaged traces of ordinary life that came before or alongside it. The backfill that preserved the pillars also mixed materials, complicating the task of reconstructing exact activities. Archaeology is not reading a clean page. It is reading a page that has been written over, folded, burned at the edges, and buried with scraps from other pages. There is also the matter of what counts as ordinary. At Göbekli Tepe, grinding stones, flint tools, animal bones, and food processing evidence appear in abundance. These are domestic in the broad sense. They belong to the work of living, but they occur in a monumental context. Does that make them ritual equipment, feast debris, ordinary refuse, or all of these at once? A grinding stone used to prepare grain for a sacred feast is still a grinding stone. A blade used to butcher an animal for a ceremony is still a practical tool. The same object can cross categories depending on use. Modern distinctions between kitchen, temple, workshop, and shrine may not map cleanly onto the site. The debate over houses therefore becomes a debate over how to recognize a society in transition. If people are moving toward more settled life, their architecture may change faster than their economy, or their ritual life may intensify before their domestic arrangements stabilize. A special building might be the first permanent structure in a landscape, with houses coming later, or houses might exist nearby in lighter forms while ritual buildings are made of stone. Or the same buildings might shift functions over time. Scholars still debate which model best fits Göbekli Tepe, and future excavations may alter the picture again. The danger is to treat uncertainty as emptiness, because no written source explains who slept where. It is easy to let imagination rush in. Fringe claims often begin in such gaps, proposing vanished advanced civilizations, unknown architects, or outsiders who supposedly taught local people how to build. But the actual uncertainty is more interesting. The question is not whether the builders were capable. The stone tools, quarries, carvings, and regional parallels show that they were. The question is what kind of early Neolithic social arrangement could produce monumentality before the full appearance of urban life. That is a real mystery, and it does not need invention to make it powerful. The absence or scarcity of early houses also changes the emotional feel of the hill. A city ruin usually speaks through abandonment. One imagines empty rooms, collapsed roofs, streets without footsteps. Göbekli Tepe speaks through gathering instead. It may have been a place people approached, used intensely, and left, at least in some phases. Its power may have come partly from not being an ordinary place of residence, a hilltop reached by effort, visible across distances, marked by beings in stone, and entered for special occasions can carry a different kind of authority than a building beside one's sleeping mat. Separation, even partial separation, can make a place sacred. Yet separation is never absolute. The people who carved the pillars also had to eat, rest, bleed, sweat, sharpen tools, and deal with weather. The sacred was not floating above life. It was made by bodies, whether they slept on the mound, nearby, or far away. The builders brought ordinary needs into extraordinary spaces. That tension is at the heart of Göbekli Tepe. It is neither a village with a slightly impressive shrine nor a temple detached from human life. It is a place where the categories themselves are still forming. The problem of no houses is therefore not a flaw in the story. It is the story. It is the open space where archaeologists must rethink what settlement, ritual, and community meant before cities. The hill asks whether permanence begins with sleeping in one place, or with returning to one place. It asks whether architecture first serves shelter or memory. It asks whether a community has to live together every day to build together across generations. And it asks how much of civilization begins not with the house, but with the shared centre that makes houses around it imaginable. Göbekli Tepe does not answer cleanly. It rarely does. But it keeps narrowing the old assumptions. There may have been fewer houses than expected, or different houses than expected, or houses not yet found, or forms of occupation that sit between camp and village. What matters is that people who were not yet city dwellers could still create a place with the gravity of a city centre. They could live across a landscape and gather on a hill. They could make stone stand where homes were scarce. They could build a centre before they built streets. At some point, the open spaces were closed, the pillars that had stood in the air, watched by people, touched by light, smoke, dust, and passing seasons, were buried under tons of material. Stone chips, soil, animal bones, tools, debris, and broken fragments filled the enclosures until the great rings disappeared back into the hill. This was not the slow drift of abandonment alone. It was an act, or a series of acts, requiring effort. People who had once raised the stones returned to cover them, or later generations came to seal what earlier hands had made. The sacred mountain, if it can be called that cautiously, did not simply fall silent. It was deliberately muted. This is one of Göbekli Tepe's most haunting facts. Many ancient monuments are abandoned when their builders leave, when climate shifts, when enemies arrive, when belief changes, when resources fail, or when new centres draw people away. Roofs collapse, walls erode. Stones are stolen for later buildings. Animals nest in the ruins. Wind and rain do the rest. But at Göbekli Tepe, the main enclosures were packed with fill in a way that protected them with uncanny effectiveness. The burial was so complete that, thousands of years later, the pillars still stood inside the mound like sealed memories. What looks to modern eyes like preservation may have begun as closure. Why would people bury such a place? The simplest answer is practical older enclosures may have been filled to stabilize the mound, create new building surfaces, or manage spaces no longer in use. In a long-lived site, architecture changes, buildings are replaced, walls are modified, older structures become inconvenient. Filling them can be easier than maintaining them. This practical explanation should not be dismissed. Human beings often do practical things for practical reasons, even at sacred places, yet the scale and character of the backfilling suggests something more than casual cleanup. The enclosures were not merely left to decay, they were incorporated into the growing body of the mound. A second possibility is that the enclosures had life cycles. They may have been born, used, renewed, and ritually buried when their period of power ended. In many societies, buildings are not inert containers. They have biographies. A house can be founded with offerings. A shrine can be renewed with sacrifice. A sacred space can be closed with ceremony. If the pillars represented ancestors, beings, or powerful presences, then covering an enclosure may not have meant destroying it. It may have meant completing it. Burial could be an act of respect, containment, transformation, or transition. The evidence remains incomplete, but the idea fits the deliberate nature of the fill and the wider Neolithic concern with memory, death, and place. There is something deeply human about burying what matters. People bury bodies not because bodies are worthless, but because they are dangerous, beloved, powerful, polluting, sacred, or socially unresolved. They bury offerings, foundations, tools, and objects to place them beyond ordinary use. They cover old floors beneath new ones. They seal memories into ground. At Göbekli Tepe, the burial of architecture may have worked in a similar emotional register. The enclosures may have become ancestors themselves, no longer active in the same way, but still present beneath the living surface of the hill. The material used to fill them adds to the mystery. It was not clean, sterile soil alone. It contained animal bones, flint artifacts, limestone debris, and other remains from human activity. Some of it may have been refuse from feasting or occupation. Some may have come from quarrying and construction. Some may have been deliberately gathered as part of closure. Archaeologists must ask whether the fill is rubbish, ritual deposit, construction material, or a mixture. The answer may be all of these. Modern categories often fail because people in the past did not always separate garbage from sacred matter as neatly as we might. The remains of a feast can be waste after eating, but they can also be the proper substance with which to close a place of memory. Imagine an enclosure near the end of its use. Its pillars have stood for generations. Some carvings are worn, some stories connected to them have changed. New structures nearby reflect different needs or different authorities. The people who gather at the hill may no longer relate to the old ring in the same way their ancestors did. Perhaps it is too powerful to leave exposed, too old to repair, too closely tied to the dead, or too difficult to reconcile with new practices. So the community fills it. Baskets of rubble are carried in. Bones from meals enter the darkening space. Stone chips fall around the bases of pillars. The carved animals vanish layer by layer. The central figures remain upright as the earth rises around them. Eventually only the tops are visible, then nothing. No dialogue survives from that moment, but the act itself speaks. Covering a monument takes commitment. It is not easier than walking away. The decision to bury suggests that the place still mattered at the moment it was closed. Indifference leaves ruins exposed. Care, fear, or obligation buries them. This burial also changed how time worked at the site. Each filled enclosure became a buried past beneath later activity. People walking on the mound may have known what lay below, at least for a while. They may have remembered the locations of older spaces through stories or surface markers now lost. Later generations may have built near or over them, aware or unaware of the exact forms beneath. The mound became a layered memory landscape, where the dead architecture supported the living surface. This is not unlike the way some Near Eastern tells grew from repeated building and rebuilding. Though Göbekli Tepe's earliest monumental fill has its own character, human settlement often makes hills from memory. Here, memory was made partly by burial. The timing of the backfilling is debated in detail because different enclosures and phases may have different histories. It would be misleading to imagine one single day when the entire site was ceremonially buried and abandoned. More likely, closure occurred over time, as structures were filled, modified, replaced, or left behind. The Great Mound is a palimpsest, not a frozen event. Some monumental forms belong to earlier phases. Smaller rectangular buildings and later uses belong to subsequent ones. What survives in the record suggests a long sequence of building and covering rather than one dramatic ending. The mystery is not one burial, but a repeated habit of turning architecture into buried ground. This habit may reflect changing social life. As the Neolithic transition advanced, people in the region increasingly moved towards settled village life, cultivation, and eventually domesticated animals. Communal structures did not disappear, but their form and social role changed. The enormous circular enclosures of Göbekli Tepe's earlier phases may have belonged to a world of larger gatherings among still mobile or semi-mobile groups. Later, as communities became more settled, ritual may have moved into different architectural settings, perhaps closer to domestic life or organized through other institutions. The old hilltop enclosures may have lost their central function as the social world that created them transformed. If this is true, then the burial of Göbekli Tepe is not simply an ending, it is evidence of transition. The people who covered the enclosures may have been living through the slow reorganization that would eventually make villages more ordinary and farming more central. The wild animal world carved into the pillars was not gone, but its place in human life was changing. Grain was becoming more managed, animals were moving gradually toward domestication, houses were becoming more permanent. New forms of community were forming. In such a world, the old monumental rings may have belonged to a past that had to be honoured, contained, or superseded. There is also the possibility of social tension. Monumental places can unify, but they can also concentrate power. If certain groups controlled access to enclosures, ritual knowledge, or feasting events, others may have challenged that authority as settlement patterns changed. A buried enclosure might mark not only respectful closure but a shift in who held influence. Perhaps old lineages lost power. Perhaps new communities preferred different forms of ritual. Perhaps the gathering network that sustained the hill weakened. Scholars still debate these possibilities, and direct evidence for conflict or political replacement is limited. But monuments often become contested when societies change. The act of burial has inspired more dramatic interpretations as well. Some popular theories connect Göbekli Tepe's closure to catastrophe, comet impacts, sudden climate events, or attempts to preserve knowledge for the future. These ideas are appealing because a buried monument feels like a message sealed in time. But the archaeological evidence does not require such claims, and most remain disputed or unsupported. The backfilling can be explained within known human behaviour's ritual closure. Rebuilding, changing use, practical stabilization, and social transformation. The real story is already strange enough. People built extraordinary stone spaces before cities, then deliberately turned them back into a hill. The burial created an accidental gift for archaeology. By sealing the enclosures, the builders protected carvings from erosion, later quarrying, and prolonged exposure. The very act that hid the site preserved it. Had the pillars remained open for thousands of years, many might have been broken, reused, weathered beyond recognition, or destroyed. Instead, the hill held them in darkness. This does not mean the builders intended preservation for us. They almost certainly did not. Their reasons belong to their own world. But the consequence is that modern excavation entered a sealed chamber of early Neolithic imagination, with a clarity that would otherwise have been impossible. There is a sadness in that clarity. The better the stones survive, the more sharply one feels the loss of everything else. The pillars remain, but the songs are gone. The fill remains, but the closing ceremony, if there was one, is gone. The animal bones remain, but the names of the hunters, cooks, mourners, and children are gone. The hill preserves stone and erases voices. It gives enough to know that something profound happened, and not enough to know exactly what it meant. Still, the burial itself may be the strongest clue to how the builders thought about place. They did not treat architecture as disposable once its use ended. They transformed it. They incorporated it into the mound, allowing the old spaces to remain present below the surface. This is a different relationship to the past from simple abandonment. It suggests continuity through concealment. The old enclosures were gone from sight, but not necessarily gone from meaning. By the time the great rings disappeared beneath the fill, the world around Göbekli Tepe was already moving toward new forms of life. The hill that had drawn people together in a pre-urban age became quieter. Later communities would build villages, cultivate fields, manage herds, and eventually give rise to the long chain of settled societies that leads towards cities, states, and written history. But under the mound, the earlier experiment remained intact, a buried memory of a time when people gathered before streets, carved wild animals before herds, raised pillars before temples had names, and then covered their own achievement with earth. The sacred mountain did not vanish because it was forgotten. It vanished because someone chose to hide it, and that choice, made in a world without writing, is one of the most eloquent things the builders ever left behind. Beyond the buried enclosures, beyond the carved animals and the sealed stone rings, another transformation is taking place so slowly that no single person can see its full shape. The world around Göbekli Tepe is crossing the farming threshold, not in one sudden leap, not through a single invention, and not because one clever group wakes one morning and decides to become farmers. The change is quieter and more relentless than that. It happens in repeated harvests, in preferred seeds, in longer stays near useful plants, in animals watched more closely than before, in storage habits, in paths returning to the same patches of land, in the growing importance of places that can feed a crowd. What begins as knowledge of the wild becomes management. What begins as gathering becomes cultivation. What begins as opportunity becomes dependence. At first, wild cereals are simply part of a broad food world. They're gathered when ripe, cut or beaten into baskets, carried back, dried, pounded, ground, cooked, and shared, but repeated harvesting changes attention. People notice which stands are dense, which grains are larger, which patches return reliably after disturbance, which places are worth defending from animals or rival groups. They may scatter seeds intentionally or unintentionally. They may clear competing plants. They may return earlier, stay longer, and plan movement around the grain. None of this needs to look like a field at first. Yet over generations, such habits begin to pull human life toward particular places. The plants change too. In wild wheat and barley, seed heads naturally shatter, dropping grain to the ground so the plant can reproduce. For human harvesters, non-shattering stalks are useful because the grain stays attached long enough to be collected. When people repeatedly gather, transport, and perhaps sow grain from plants with these traits, they create selection pressure. Slowly, the plant becomes less suited to life without humans and more suited to human harvest. This is domestication. But it's not a clean border. For a long time, wild, managed, cultivated, and domesticated forms may overlap. Scholars still debate the exact pace and locations of these transitions, but the broader pattern is clear. The relationship between people and plants tightens until neither side is quite what it was before. Animals approach the threshold differently. The wild creatures carved at Göbekli Tepe belong to a world of hunting, danger, and symbolic force. But nearby, in the broader Fertile Crescent, humans are beginning to alter their relationships with sheep, goats, pigs, and cattle. At first, this may involve intensified hunting, selective targeting, keeping young animals, controlling movement, or returning to the same herds. True domestication requires changes in breeding, behavior, body size, and human management. It takes time. A wild goat does not become a herd animal because someone wants it to, but once people begin to shape animal reproduction and survival, a new kind of landscape appears, one in which living food can be kept near human communities. This shift changes everything, though not always in ways that feel like progress to those living through it. Farming can support larger populations, but it also creates new burdens. Fields demand labour, stored grain attracts pests, thieves, and obligations. Diets can narrow. Disease can spread more easily where people and animals live close together. Social inequality can deepen when land, herds, and storage become controllable wealth. The farming threshold is not simply a triumph. It is a bargain. Humans gain reliability and scale, but they also bind themselves to cycles of work and vulnerability that mobile foragers often avoided. No single explanation fully accounts for why communities crossed this threshold, because the decision was probably never made once. It was made gradually, until turning back became difficult. Göbekli Tepe stands near this moment of tightening dependence. Its earliest phases still look toward a wild world of hunting and gathering, but its later context belongs to a region where settled villages, cultivated plants, and managed animals become increasingly important. The hill may not be the cause of farming, but it belongs to the social environment in which farming becomes thinkable, useful, and eventually necessary. If people gather for feasts, ceremonies, labor, and memory, then food supply becomes a social problem. If certain places draw people repeatedly, then local resources become more intensively used. If staying longer near meaningful centers becomes valuable, then cultivation offers a way to support that staying. The first villages are not miniature cities. They're intimate, dense, and often strange to modern eyes. Houses may be built close together, roofs may serve as pathways, burials may occur beneath floors, skulls may be removed, plastered, displayed, or reburied. Communal buildings may stand beside domestic spaces. Storage may be household-based or shared. The living and dead remain physically close. In the Near Eastern Neolithic, settlement does not mean the end of ritual complexity. It often intensifies it. The home itself can become a place of ancestry and memory. The sacred center does not vanish. It changes address. This may be part of what happens after the great enclosures of Göbekli Tepe. As communities settle more permanently, the need for distant or hilltop gathering places may shift. Ritual authority may move into villages. Ancestors may be kept beneath floors rather than gathered around monumental pillars. Food production may become woven into household identity. The enormous circular spaces give way to smaller structures, different forms, and new relationships between daily life and symbolic life. The wild animals still matter, but sheep, goats, grain, storage, and houses begin to reshape imagination. The world of the pillars is not destroyed in a single moment. It is absorbed, transformed, and partly left behind. One lesser-known detail of this transition is how much work early grain required. Before industrial milling, before metal sickles, before draft animals pulling ploughs, every stage depended on human bodies. Harvesting with stone blades leaves gloss on tools. Carrying grain strains backs and shoulders. Grinding grain on stone can take hours and gradually wear teeth through tiny particles of grit in the flour, bread, porridge, gruel, beer-like drinks. And other cereal foods are not easy gifts of agriculture. They are the result of repeated labour. The rise of farming therefore also means the rise of new daily disciplines. Time becomes organised around fields, harvests, storage, and processing. The relationship to land changes with this discipline. A forager may know a vast territory through movement. A farmer must return to the same plot, protect it, and plan for its future. This does not mean early farmers stopped hunting or gathering. Many continued to do both. But the balance shifts. Land becomes not only remembered but invested in. A field carries past labour. A herd carries future wealth. A storage bin carries survival through lean months. These things create attachment, but also anxiety. They can be lost. They can be stolen. They can fail. The settled life that later civilizations celebrate is born with worry inside it. In this light, Göbekli Tepe becomes a monument from the last great age before that worry fully takes hold, and also from the first age when it begins. Its builders stand at the edge of a new human condition. Behind them are countless generations of mobile knowledge, wild abundance, seasonal return, and flexible survival. Ahead are villages, fields, herds, property, inheritance, crowding, hierarchy, and eventually cities. The hill belongs to both directions. Its carved animals look back to wild power. Its monumental labour looks forward to organised communities. Its feasts may belong to a foraging world, while its need for repeated provisioning points toward cultivation. The farming threshold also changes the meaning of surplus. In a mobile world, carrying too much can be a burden. In a settled world, stored food becomes security and power. The ability to accumulate grain or manage animals allows some people to host feasts, support specialists, survive shortages, and influence others. Over time, this can create new inequalities. At Göbekli Tepe, clear evidence for strong hierarchy remains debated, but the social mechanisms are visible in outline. Those who can gather labour, distribute food, control ritual knowledge, or manage access to meaningful places may gain authority. Farming does not invent power, but it gives power new tools. Still, the transition was not inevitable. Many human groups around the world continued hunting and gathering long after agriculture existed. Some adopted farming partially, some abandoned it, some combined cultivation with seasonal movement. The idea that farming is an obvious improvement is a later assumption shaped by the world farming created. For the people of the early Neolithic, the shift may have felt less like progress and more like a series of local decisions: stay here a little longer. Gather this grain again, protect this patch, keep these animals nearby, build this wall stronger, store this food for the next gathering. Only after centuries does the pattern become visible. By then, the threshold has been crossed. Villages grow more stable. Domesticated plants and animals become more common. Human populations expand. The landscape begins to show marks of repeated cultivation and grazing. The old wild abundance does not vanish, but it is increasingly reorganized around human needs. This is the beginning of the long human project of remaking environments, a project that will eventually produce irrigation canals, ploughed fields, orchards, city walls, roads, empires, an ecological damage on scales the builders of Göbekli Tepe could not have imagined. And yet the first step is intimate. A seed held back, a patch revisited, a young animal kept alive, a grinding stone worn smooth by use, a feast that requires more food than chance can provide, a hill that draws people back until the surrounding land begins to answer human expectation. The farming threshold is not crossed by civilization already formed. It is crossed by people still close to the wild, still carving foxes and snakes into stone, still hunting dangerous animals, still burying their monumental spaces when their meaning changes. Göbekli Tepe does not stand outside this transformation. It stands inside the turning. It shows that before fields dominate the horizon, humans are already creating centers of obligation. Before domestic grain becomes daily bread, wild grain may already be feeding gatherings large enough to matter. Before herds become wealth, wild animals are already symbols, meals, and memories. This city is still far away, but the conditions that will one day make cities possible are gathering quietly in the hands of people who may not yet think of themselves as farmers. The threshold is crossed slowly, and once crossed, the world behind it becomes difficult to see. That is why Göbekli Tepe matters so much. It preserves a glimpse of the moment before the door fully closes, when humans are still negotiating with wild landscapes, still living between movement and settlement, still building in stone before the farmers completely claim the future. A place as old and strange as Göbekli Tepe almost invites the wrong kind of certainty. The moment a hill produces pillars older than expected, carved animals without explanation, buried enclosures, and a timeline that unsettles familiar ideas about civilization, imagination rushes toward the gap. Where evidence is incomplete, stories multiply. Some are careful, grounded, and useful. Others are dramatic, seductive, and unsupported. Göbekli Tepe has become famous not only because of what archaeology has found, but because of what modern people want it to mean. It has been turned into a lost temple, a star map, a warning from a vanished civilization, a memorial to cosmic disaster, even a clue in stories about ancient outsiders. The hill has become a mirror, and different ages tend to see their own fears inside it. The first thing to say is simple: Göbekli Tepe does not need fringe theories to be astonishing. The mainstream evidence is already extraordinary. Human communities at the dawn of the Neolithic cut large limestone pillars, arranged them in monumental spaces, carved them with animals and signs, used the site over long periods, and deliberately buried major enclosures. They did this before cities, before writing, before pottery was widespread in the region, and before farming had fully transformed daily life. That is not a modest claim. It is one of the most important archaeological revelations of the last century. Adding unsupported speculation often makes the story less impressive, not more, because it takes achievement away from the actual people who built the place. One popular line of interpretation turns Göbekli Tepe into evidence of a lost advanced civilization. In this view, the site is too early, too complex, or too monumental to have been made by hunter-gatherers or early Neolithic communities, so it must be the remnant of some forgotten culture destroyed before recorded history. The appeal is obvious. A vanished civilization gives the stones a dramatic origin and turns archaeology into a recovery of forbidden memory. But the evidence does not require this. The tools, quarry marks, regional parallels, animal bones, plant processing equipment, and broader Neolithic context all fit human communities of the period. The builders did not need metal, wheels, writing, or cities to move limestone and carve reliefs. They needed skill, cooperation, belief, and time. The lost civilization idea often rests on underestimating people without cities. This is an old mistake wearing a new costume, because later civilization is associated with writing, states, and urban life. It becomes easy to imagine that people before those things lacked organization or imagination. Göbekli Tepe proves the opposite. It does not show that some unknown urban society must be hidden behind the evidence. It shows that pre-urban societies were capable of more than many scholars once assumed. The mystery should expand our understanding of early humans, not replace them with a more familiar kind of civilization. Another popular claim links the site to astronomy. Some researchers and independent writers have suggested that certain animal reliefs may represent constellations, that pillars encode celestial events, or that the site records a comet impact connected with the Younger Dryas. The most famous versions focus on the vulture and other figures on Pillar 43, reading them as a kind of sky chart. These ideas are intriguing because ancient people certainly watched the sky. Seasonal gatherings, hunting, plant cycles, and ritual calendars often depend on celestial observation. It would not be surprising if the builders of Göbekli Tepe paid close attention to stars, sun, moon, and horizon. But there is a wide gap between saying the sky mattered and proving that a specific panel records a specific astronomical event. The difficulty is method. Animal shapes can be matched to constellations in many ways if one has enough freedom. Modern constellations are not universal, and ancient star groupings vary across cultures. Without texts, repeated clear alignments, or strong contextual support, astronomical readings can become circular. The theory identifies the animal confirms the theory, and uncertainty disappears too easily. Scholars still debate whether some alignments or motifs at Göbekli Tepe may have celestial significance, but the stronger claims remain disputed. The evidence remains incomplete, and caution is not the enemy of wonder. It is what keeps wonder attached to reality. The comet impact theory carries similar problems. The Younger Dryas was a real climatic event, and its causes remain an area of scientific discussion. Some have argued that an extraterrestrial impact or airburst triggered major environmental change around 12,900 years ago, and that Göbekli Tepe somehow preserves memory of this catastrophe. But the connection between the site's imagery and such an event is highly speculative. Even if future science clarified the Younger Dryas in favour of one cause or another, it would not automatically prove that the builders encoded it in stone. Human memory can preserve disasters for long periods in oral tradition, but proving a direct link across millennia requires more than resemblance and desire. Catastrophe stories are powerful because they give monuments urgency. A buried site becomes a warning, a strange carving becomes a message, a lost world becomes a victim of fire from the sky. Yet Göbekli Tepe can be understood within known processes of climate change, social gathering, ritual life, a Neolithic transition without requiring a single dramatic apocalypse. The end of the Ice Age was already a world-altering transformation. It reshaped landscapes, resources, and human possibilities. Slow upheaval can be as consequential as sudden disaster, and sometimes more so. Then there are the claims involving outsiders, ancient astronauts, vanished teachers, or beings who supposedly brought knowledge to humans. These ideas are unsupported and, more importantly, unnecessary. They often rely on the assumption that early people could not have achieved complex architecture on their own. But every stone at Göbekli Tepe belongs to a human technological world limestone cut from local bedrock, shaped with stone tools, moved with human labour, placed in forms echoed across nearby Neolithic sites. There is no evidence of non-human technology, no anomalous materials, no machinery, no writing from a lost advanced source. What exists is remarkable human work. The irony is that fringe theories often claim to honour the mystery while flattening it. They make Göbekli Tepe easier, not harder. A lost master civilization explains the pillars too quickly. A comet warning explains the carvings too neatly. Ancient outsiders explain human achievement by removing it from humans. The real archaeological mystery is more demanding. It asks how communities without cities organize themselves. It asks how ritual, feasting, climate, wild resources, an emerging settlement interacted. It asks why certain animals were carved, why enclosures were buried, why monumentality arose in this region at this time, and how all of this relates to the beginnings of agriculture. These questions do not have simple answers, but they are the right questions. This does not mean mainstream archaeology has everything solved. Far from it. Scholars still debate the function of the enclosures, the degree of occupation at the site, the meaning of the T-shaped pillars, the role of feasting, the interpretation of human bone fragments, the relationship between Göbekli Tepe and nearby sites, and the exact social organization of its builders. Interpretations have changed before and will change again. The early image of a purely ritual sanctuary has already become more complex as evidence for broader activity and regional parallels has grown. Good archaeology is not a fixed wall of certainty. It is a disciplined argument with evidence at its centre. The discipline matters because the stakes are high. Göbekli Tepe sits near the beginning of the Neolithic transformation, one of the most consequential shifts in human history. If interpreted carelessly, it becomes a blank screen for modern fantasies. If interpreted carefully, it becomes something far more valuable, a rare window into the social and symbolic lives of people living at the edge of farming, settlement, and monumentality. It allows us to see that the road to civilization was not a straight line from hunger to grain to cities. It was also shaped by memory, ritual, animals, death, gathering, landscape, and the human need to make meaning durable. There is room for imagination here, but imagination has to know where the ground is. It is reasonable to imagine firelight moving across carvings, people gathering for feasts, hunters bringing wild animals to the hill, elders remembering older enclosures, or builders hauling limestone with the ropes and levers. These images are grounded in evidence and human possibility. It is less reasonable to claim certainty about star maps, cosmic warnings, or lost technologies without stronger proof. The difference is not between boring science and exciting mystery. It is between mystery that deepens the past and mystery that replaces it. The unsupported theories also reveal something about the modern world. Many people find it difficult to believe that humans before agriculture could be so complex because modern culture still equates progress with machines, cities, and written knowledge. Göbekli Tepe undermines that assumption. It shows that symbolic ambition does not wait for bureaucracy. Cooperation does not wait for kings. Sacred architecture does not wait for urban planning. Human imagination was not invented by civilization. Civilization inherited it. This may be the most important correction the hill offers. The people who built Göbekli Tepe were not primitive versions of us. They were humans adapted to a different world, with different skills, different pressures, and different forms of intelligence. They could read tracks, seasons, stone, animal behavior, plant cycles, and social obligations with precision most modern people do not possess. They could organize large projects through means that leave few traces. They could create symbolic spaces that still command attention after 11,000 years. To call that impossible without a lost civilization is not wonder. It is failure to recognize human depth. So the fringe theories should not be the center of the story. They belong at the edge, as signs of how powerful the site has become in modern imagination. They remind us that mystery attracts certainty the way fire attracts moths. But the real Göbekli Tepe remains more patient. It does not confess to being a star map. It does not announce a vanished empire. It does not point to outsiders. It gives stone, bone, tools, fill, carvings, and context. It asks to be read slowly. And when it's read slowly, the story becomes stranger than the fantasies. A real human community, or network of communities, before cities and before full farming, built a monumental centre on a hill. They carved wild animals into pillars shaped like beings. They gathered, worked, ate, remembered, and eventually buried the spaces they had made. Nearby sites show they were part of a wider regional world of symbolic experiment. The rise of agriculture unfolded around and after them, not as a simple cause but as part of a tangled transformation. This is not a footnote to civilization. It is one of the places where the foundations begin to move. Göbekli Tepe does not need to be rescued from archaeology by speculation. Archaeology is what rescued it from the hill. The mystery is still there, but it is sharper now, framed by evidence rather than fog. And that mystery is enough humans, before history, standing on a limestone plateau, building something that should not have been expected, and proving that the deep past was never as simple as the stories told about it. What Göbekli Tepe changed was not the fact that early humans were intelligent. Archaeology had already known that for a long time. Cave art, long-distance exchange, delicate stone tools, burial practices, ornaments, and Ice Age symbolic objects had already shown that human minds were complex far earlier than farming. What Göbekli Tepe changed was the scale at which that complexity could appear before cities. It forced a difficult recognition. People at the edge of the Neolithic were not merely waiting for agriculture to unlock social ambition. They were already capable of gathering, planning, carving, building, remembering, and transforming a hill into a centre of power. The old sequence did not vanish, but it lost its simplicity. The site did not prove that religion came before agriculture in every place. It did not prove that temples invented farming in a single dramatic reversal. But it made that question unavoidable. Before Göbekli Tepe became widely known, it was easier to imagine ritual monumentality as a result of settled surplus. After Göbekli Tepe, the relationship had to be reconsidered. Perhaps farming, settlement, ritual, and social hierarchy did not line up like stones on a path. Perhaps they pulled on one another. A gathering place could create demand for food. Food production could support larger gatherings. Larger gatherings could produce new authority. New authority could organize more labor. More labor could build stronger centers. Civilization, in this view, does not begin with one cause. It begins as a knot. That knot matters because it changes the way we think about the first cities themselves. Cities are often described through practical needs: irrigation, defense, trade, administration, storage, population growth. All of these matter. But Göbekli Tepe suggests that the city also has older roots in the human attraction to centers. Long before streets and walls, people created places that gathered meaning. A hilltop, a burial ground, a spring, a cave, a stone circle, a communal building. These could draw people across distances and turn landscape into society. Later cities would do the same at a larger scale. They would gather food, labor, gods, markets, ancestors, rulers, stories, and strangers into one dense place. Göbekli Tepe is not a city, but it reveals one of the deep impulses from which cities grow. It also changed how archaeologists think about hierarchy. Monumental construction often suggests leadership, but leadership does not always mean kings. At Göbekli Tepe, there is no clear palace, no royal burial, no written command, no obvious administrative machinery. Yet the work still required coordination. This points toward forms of authority that may have been temporary, ritualized, persuasive, competitive, or distributed among groups. Someone, or some group, had influence. Someone knew how to gather people. Someone held knowledge of how the stone should stand and what the carvings meant. But that influence may not have looked like the fixed power of later rulers. The hill belongs to a world where social inequality may have been emerging, but had not yet hardened into the institutions visible in later states. Scholars still debate how much hierarchy the site reflects, and the evidence remains incomplete. This uncertainty is valuable. It prevents the past from being squeezed into modern political shapes. People did not move directly from equality to kingship, from campfire to palace. There were many intermediate forms respected elders, ritual specialists, successful hunters, generous hosts, lineage leaders, healers, organizers, rivals, and people whose power existed only in certain seasons or ceremonies. A person who could gather labor for a pillar might not control daily life. A group that hosted a feast might gain prestige without ruling permanently. Göbekli Tepe opens a window onto these subtler forms of power, the kind that rarely survive in written history because they existed before writing and before the state. The site also changed the meaning of architecture. A building is never only shelter. Even ordinary houses organize relationships: who sleeps where, who enters, who stores food, who belongs, who is excluded. Monumental buildings intensify that power. They create shared experience. They make certain movements possible and others impossible. They place bodies under stone, around centers, through entrances, before images. At Göbekli Tepe, architecture may have shaped ritual performance, social memory, and emotional response. The pillars did not simply symbolize a worldview, they helped produce one. People gathered inside spaces designed to affect them, and that effect may have been part of the site's authority. One surprising legacy of Göbekli Tepe is how it makes the invisible visible by contrast. Because the stone survives so dramatically, it reminds us how much of earlier symbolic life must have vanished elsewhere. If people could build Göbekli Tepe in limestone, what did other groups build in wood? What did they paint on hides, weave into textiles, carve into posts, arrange with bones, mark with pigments, or perform in places where nothing durable remains? The hill may not be the beginning of monumental imagination. It may be one rare surviving expression of a much wider capacity. Stone has preserved one tradition while countless others disappeared without trace. This means the archaeological record may underestimate ancient social complexity not by a little, but by a great deal. At the same time, Göbekli Tepe cautions against imagining every vanished trace as equally grand. Evidence still matters. The site is powerful because it is real, excavated, dated, contextualized, and connected to a regional world. It does not give permission to invent monuments wherever evidence is absent. Instead, it teaches humility. The past may have contained more than survives, but what survives must still guide interpretation. That balance between openness and discipline is one of the lasting lessons of the hill. Göbekli Tepe also shifted public imagination. For many people, it became the first time they encountered the deep Neolithic, not as a dull prelude to civilization, but as a world of mystery and achievement in its own right. The word ancient often evokes Egypt, Mesopotamia, Greece, Rome, or other literate civilizations. Göbekli Tepe pushes ancientness farther back, into a world without texts, where human ambition is harder to read but no less real. It reminds the modern mind that history is only the narrow illuminated strip at the end of a much longer human night. Most of the human story happened before writing, and much of it happened before farming. The silence of that time is not the same as emptiness. For archaeology, the site strengthened a broader movement away from linear progress stories. The rise of civilization is no longer understood as a simple ladder from primitive to advanced. It is a branching process full of experiments, reversals, regional differences, and unexpected combinations. Some hunter-gatherers built large settlements without farming. Some farmers remained small-scale for millennia. Some communities created rich ritual worlds without cities. Some cities rose and collapsed quickly. Göbekli Tepe belongs to this more complex picture. It is not an anomaly to be explained away. but a sign that human social evolution is more flexible than older models allowed. The relationship between belief and survival also looks different after Göbekli Tepe. Modern thought often separates the practical from the symbolic: food on one side, ritual on the other, economy on one side, religion on the other. But early societies rarely fit such divisions. A hunt can be subsistence and ceremony. A feast can be nutrition and politics. A building can be shelter and cosmology. A dead ancestor can be memory and authority. Göbekli Tepe shows this entanglement clearly. The pillars cannot be understood without food, and the food cannot be understood without gathering, and the gathering cannot be understood without meaning. Human beings do not survive first and make meaning later. They survive through meaning. This may be the deepest change the site brings. It moves imagination away from the idea that civilization began when humans solved hunger. Hunger was never fully solved. Even later cities suffered famine, disease, violence, and collapse. Civilization began, in part, when people reorganized life around shared centers, powerful enough to demand new forms of labor and dependence. Göbekli Tepe reveals such a center before the city. It shows humans making a place that drew energy toward itself. A place for which people hunted, gathered, carved, carried, ate, buried, and returned. Its legacy also lives in the questions now asked of other sites. Archaeologists look more carefully for special buildings in early settlements. They reconsider the role of feasting in social change. They examine quarry landscapes, symbolic imagery, and evidence of communal labor with new attention. They compare regional networks rather than isolating single sites. Göbekli Tepe did not answer all these questions, but it made them sharper. In archaeology, a discovery's importance is not measured only by what it proves. It is measured by how many old assumptions it makes impossible to hold without revision. And yet, for all its influence, Göbekli Tepe remains stubbornly itself. It is not merely an argument in academic debate. It is a hill with stone enclosures under the sky. It is a place where animals still hold their forms in limestone. It is a mound shaped by human hands and human concealment. It is a reminder that every model of the past is provisional, because the earth can still produce something that rearranges the sequence. The next discovery may complicate Göbekli Tepe in turn. That is not a weakness of archaeology. It is the source of its life. What changed, finally, was expectation. Before the hill was understood, many people would not have expected monumentality of this kind so early. After it, they had to. The builders of Göbekli Tepe expanded the known range of human possibility before cities. They showed that large-scale symbolic construction could emerge from communities still deeply tied to wild landscapes. They showed that the roots of civilization reach not only into fields and granaries, but into ritual, death, animals, memory, and the pull of gathering. The city was not there yet, but some of its oldest ingredients were. Göbekli Tepe is not a city, and that is what makes it so unsettling. A true city has density, streets, households, storage systems, social divisions, administration, markets, or exchange networks, long-term residents, and usually some way of managing strangers who live side by side. Göbekli Tepe does not give us that world. It gives us something earlier and stranger, a center without urban life, a gathering place without writing, a monumental landscape before the normal machinery of civilization has fully appeared. It is not the first city. It is the shadow of the idea that will one day make cities possible. The phrase "the city before cities" works because the hill carries urban ambition without urban form. People came together there to do what no small household could do alone. They raised stones larger than daily necessity required. They carved beings into limestone. They organized food, labor, memory, and perhaps death around a shared place. They made a hill into a center. That act is one of the oldest roots of civilization, the decision that one place matters enough for many people to return. Work, eat, remember, and leave something behind. By the time later cities rise in Mesopotamia, the world has changed beyond recognition. Fields spread, herds move under human control, villages grow into towns, temples become institutions. Writing begins as marks of accounting and administration before it becomes literature, law, and royal memory. Power hardens. Surplus becomes measurable. Labor becomes organized at scales Göbekli Tepe's builders may never have imagined. But beneath all of that lies an older human pattern. The gathering around a meaningful center. The city does not begin only in the granary. It begins in the pull of place. Göbekli Tepe reminds us that humans were building shared worlds before they were building urban ones. They did not yet have kings whose names could be carved into stone. They did not yet have scribes to preserve the official version of events. They did not yet have city walls to separate inside from outside. But they had the ability to make symbols endure, to coordinate work, to create obligations, and to bind scattered lives to a remembered landscape. What survives in the records suggests a society not simple, not urban, but powerful in ways that older models struggled to see. The final mystery is not whether humans should have been able to build it. They could, and they did. The deeper mystery is why this place mattered so much, why its builders chose these forms, why animals filled the stones, why the great enclosures were eventually buried, and how much of the world that created them has vanished without leaving anything so durable behind. Göbekli Tepe is not an answer carved into the earth. It is a surviving fragment of a much larger human transformation. And perhaps that is why the hill still feels alive. It stands at the edge between movement and settlement, wildness and cultivation, memory and history. It belongs to people who still hunted dangerous animals, gathered wild grain, and lived close to landscapes not yet domesticated, yet who also built with a permanence that seems to lean toward the future. They were not behind us in any simple sense. They were elsewhere, in another arrangement of life, solving problems and serving meanings that only partly overlap with our own. The city before cities was never a city of houses. It was a city of return, a city of ceremony, labor, animals, stone, food, and buried memory. Its streets were paths across the plateau. Its walls were rings of pillars. Its citizens may have been visitors, kin groups, hunters, builders, mourners, hosts, and children learning that this hill was unlike any other hill. Its records were not written in words but in carvings, bones, fills, and the stubborn survival of limestone under soil. That is the legacy of Göbekli Tepe. It changes the beginning of the story, not by replacing archaeology with fantasy, but by making humanity larger. It shows that before civilization became visible as cities, something city-like already existed in the human imagination, the urge to gather around a center and make it last. After the hill is quiet again, the mind keeps returning to the same image pillars under earth, standing in darkness while the world above changes. Grass grows over them, rain falls, animals cross the mound, farmers work nearby fields, empires rise far away, speak their languages, carve their own gods, fight their wars, and vanish. The stones remain where they were placed, not because they were understood, but because they were hidden. There is something gentle in that long concealment. Göbekli Tepe did not survive as a proud ruin open to the sky. It survived as a secret held by the ground. The people who buried it could not know who would uncover it. They could not know that one day their hill would trouble the timelines of scholars and fascinate people across the world. They acted for reasons that belonged to their own lives, their own dead, their own fears, their own obligations, and still, through that act, they sent something forward. Civilizations often imagine themselves permanent. They build walls, towers, archives, temples, roads, and monuments as if stone can defeat time. But time is patient. It wears names away. It breaks languages. It turns sacred places into puzzles and ordinary settlements into dust. What lasts is rarely the whole truth. More often, it is a fragment strong enough to survive and strange enough to make the future wonder. Göbekli Tepe is one of those fragments. It does not explain everything. It does not give back the songs, the faces, the ceremonies, or the names of the people who stood among the pillars. But it gives back enough to change the silence. It tells us that before cities, before writing, before the first empires, humans were already making places that reached beyond immediate need. They were already binding memory to landscape. They were already building for invisible meanings. The hill remains there, rounded beneath the Anatolian sky, no longer entirely hidden and not entirely revealed. Its animals still move only in stone. Its pillars still watch without faces. Around it, the modern world continues, loud and temporary. Beneath that noise, the older image lingers, people gathering on a high plateau at the edge of a warming world, raising stones for reasons we can almost feel but never fully know.